Sometimes, the only thing more terrifying than falling is staying where you are. Imagine being trapped, hunted, forced to confront the one thing that shattered you years ago. This is the haunting premise of The Face of Fear, a chilling suspense novel from the mind of master storyteller Dean Koontz. It's a story that began in 1977 and has since gripped readers around the world, becoming one of the many classics from a man whose books have sold over 500 million copies. This is the author who brought you Intensity, Odd Thomas, and a legacy of edge-of-your-seat thrillers, stories so compelling that many, like Odd Thomas, have been brought to the screen. The Face of Fear itself was adapted into a television film in 1990. As you listen, you'll experience this story through a third-person retelling, designed to pull you into the heart of the action. The visuals you'll see are created with today's technology. While they may not perfectly match every scene from the novel, they are crafted to help you visualize the world and immerse yourself in the atmosphere. You'll follow a desperate game of cat and mouse that will test the limits of human endurance and will. We'll also uncover the fascinating facts, behind-the-scenes details, and trivia from the book's journey to the screen. So, settle in and let the tension build. The story begins. The engine died, and the city's night sounds rushed in to fill the silence. The distant thrum of traffic, the whisper of wind through bare branches, and then, cutting through it all, the rising wail of a siren somewhere behind him. His body tensed. A cold certainty crystallized in his mind. They know. They've found me out. But the thought brought no fear, only a sharp, electric thrill. He wasn't the type to surrender, to let them snap cuffs on his wrists. That was beneath him. The siren grew louder, closer. He watched the rear-view mirror, tracking the pulse of red light as it swelled in the darkness. His hand moved to the .38 in its shoulder holster, fingers finding the familiar weight of the grip. He waited, muscles coiled, ready to throw open the door and meet whatever came. But the squad car blew past him, its siren fading as it took the corner 2 blocks away. Not for him, then. Almost disappointed, he holstered the weapon and studied the street through the windshield. The mercury lamps cast their sickly purple-white glow over the parked cars and the townhouses, illuminating empty sidewalks and dark windows. Good. No witnesses. No one to mark his presence here. He was a big man, 6'4", broad-shouldered, thick-necked, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never known fear. His size was a gift of genetics, not of effort. He never exercised, never dieted, and yet his body stayed hard and lean. The doctor had warned him that the constant tension burning inside him would kill him young, but Bollinger didn't care. That tension was what kept him sharp, kept him ready. It was a survival factor, not a weakness. Nervous? No, that word didn't apply to him. He was never nervous, but he was always, perpetually tense, and that was a good thing. That was what made him invincible. Nothing could surprise him. Nothing could catch him off guard. He stepped out of the car, crossed the street, and climbed the steps to the brownstone's foyer. Inside, the mosaic floor gleamed under bright lights, and he noted the clean tiles, the polished surfaces of a well-maintained building. The inner door was locked, but that was no obstacle. He knew which buttons to push. He pressed the Yardley apartment first, knowing it wasn't the Hutchinsons but counting on the man's helpfulness. A tinny voice answered, and Bollinger pretended to be looking for the wrong apartment. The exchange was brief, just enough to get the man to hang up without suspicion. Then he rang the Hutchinsons. They buzzed him through without even asking who he was. Careless people. The downstairs hall was warm and spotless, the air smelling faintly of old wood and furniture polish. He walked past the marble bench, past the beveled mirror, and stopped before Edna Mowry's door. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves, then reached into his coat. The wallet came out first, and then the knife, a slender blade, 7 inches long, spring-loaded, and razor-sharp. He touched the button on the handle, and the steel flicked into view, catching the light. For a moment, the blade held him transfixed, and lines of poetry unspooled through his mind. William Blake's words, dark and visceral, images of nerves turning to marrow, of bones hardening in swift diseases. The poetry was familiar, comfortable, like an old friend. He was an admirer of Blake, a student of his work. It was only natural that the verses should come to him now, in this moment of quiet anticipation. He rang the bell. A soft voice answered from inside, asking who was there. He identified himself as the police, his tone steady and authoritative. He could hear the hesitation in her voice, the thin note of apprehension. He knew she would be cautious, but he was prepared for that. He had the wallet ready, the badge visible, the photo identification in its plastic window. She asked him to hold it up, to show it through the crack in the door. He did. She studied it, her green eyes a shade of green he hadn't been able to see from the audience, where he'd watched her perform night after night, scanning the ID card, the badge, his face. He watched her watching him, taking in every detail of her appearance, the dark hair, the perfect fingers, the blood-red nails that had looked black under the stage lights. She asked him what the trouble was. He deflected the question, insisting he needed to question her properly, not through a crack in the door. He mentioned patience, quoted Muhammad, watched her expression shift from suspicion to something softer. She asked if he was a Muslim. He told her he was just a man who'd acquired knowledge enough to shock those who assumed policemen were ignorant. The words came easily, part of the performance he'd refined over years. She winced at her own presumption, then smiled. The smile was dazzling. He'd never seen her smile before, not once in all the nights he'd watched her on stage, her face a cold mask of indifference as she moved through her routine. She closed the door to put on a robe. He waited, the knife still in his left hand held flat against his coat. A moment later she opened the door again, the security chain removed, and gestured for him to enter. He stepped past her into the apartment, and as the door closed behind him, everything changed. The blade caught the light as Bollinger turned it over in his mind, Blake's dark verses still echoing through his thoughts, images of cities where bones hardened and senses inward rushed, shrinking beneath infection. The poetry felt right, somehow an appropriate prelude to what was coming. He pressed the bell, and from within came her voice, musical, pleasant, but with an unmistakable thread of unease tightening around her words. She asked who was there, and he answered with practiced authority, identifying himself as the police. When she pressed for details, he was deliberately vague, suggesting she might have witnessed something important at her workplace. Her refusal came quickly, almost reflexively. She saw nothing, she told him. She wore blinders in that place. He responded with impatience, hinting that a warrant could be obtained if she refused to cooperate. The threat worked its way under her defenses. She asked how she could be certain he was really an officer, and he responded with theatrical exasperation, commenting on how everyone in New York suspected everyone else. When she asked about the security chain, he confirmed that he expected her to use it, to open the door only as far as the chain allowed. Hesitantly, she slid back the bolt lock, and the door opened an inch. Through the gap, he held up his wallet, displaying the badge and the photo identification, letting her study them carefully. She looked up from the ID, and for the first time he saw her eyes clearly, not blue as he'd thought from the distant shadows of the audience, but a deep, vivid green, the most attractive eyes he'd ever seen. She pushed a strand of dark hair from her face, and he noted the long, perfect fingers, the blood-red nails that had appeared black beneath the stage lights. She asked again about the trouble, but he deflected her question, insisting he couldn't discuss it through a crack in the door. When she hesitated, he quoted Muhammad on patience, watching her expression shift to curiosity. She asked if he was a Muslim, and he told her no, just a man who'd acquired knowledge to surprise those who underestimated policemen. She winced at her own assumption, then smiled the first time he'd seen her smile in all the nights he'd watched her perform. It was dazzling. She closed the door, and he waited in the hallway, alert for anyone who might pass, keeping the knife concealed against his coat. Less than a minute later she returned, removing the chain and inviting him inside. He stepped past her, and she closed the door, sliding the bolt lock back into place. She began to ask about the trouble, but before she could finish the question, he moved with surprising speed for such a large man. He slammed her back against the door, the knife shifting to his right hand, the point pricking lightly at her throat. Her eyes went wide, the breath knocked out of her, her voice stolen. He delivered his threat in a fierce whisper, no noise, no call for help, or he'd drive the blade through her throat. He demanded to know if she understood, and when she finally managed to speak, her reply came thin and trembling. She stared at him, her gaze tracing his features, then falling to the knife in his hand. He asked if she would cooperate, and she was silent, her eyes still fixed on the blade. He pressed closer, his voice dropping low as he warned her that he would skewer her where she stood if she didn't comply. He was breathing hard now, the rush of the moment electrifying him. He felt the tremor pass through her, a vibration that traveled from her body into the blade, and he grinned, savoring the moment. Her voice, still shaking, asked what he wanted. He answered lightly, dismissively, just a little loving, he said, as if he were ordering a cup of coffee. She closed her eyes and asked if he was him. The question hung in the air between them. He watched her, amused, as a thin line of blood appeared at her throat, a bead of crimson sliding down to the collar of her robe. He studied it with the detached fascination of a scientist examining a rare specimen, almost mesmerized by the sight. He played dumb, asking who she meant. She was too frightened to say it plainly at first, but finally she forced the words out. Was he the one who'd cut up all those other women? He pretended to understand slowly, as if the thought had just occurred to him. The butcher, she meant. He asked if that was who she was talking about, and then he began to tease her, reciting details from the newspapers, the slashed throats, the disembowelments, the ears found on the nightstand. He watched her shudder at each word and found it deeply satisfying. He told her she had nothing to fear, that he wasn't the butcher. His voice was soothing now, almost tender. He patted her shoulder, smoothed her dark hair, trying to calm her like a nervous animal. He assured her that he didn't want to harm her, that if she cooperated, she would come through this unharmed. She searched his face, trying to determine if he was telling the truth. He pretended to be hurt by her suspicion, calling her flawless, telling her how beautiful she was. He commented on the scent of strawberries on her breath, asking if she'd been eating them. When she called him crazy, he pressed the knife a little harder, drawing a soft whimper from her. The tears began to form in her eyes. He pressed again, insisting on an answer. Finally, she admitted it was wine, strawberry wine. She offered to get him some, but he refused, telling her he'd get it himself. First, though, he needed to take her into the bedroom and tie her up. He explained. It was for her own good, to keep her from trying to escape and forcing him to kill her. Still holding the knife to her throat, he kissed her. Her lips were cold, unresponsive. She whispered a plea, but he ignored it, telling her to relax and enjoy herself. He untied the sash at her waist, and the robe fell open to reveal she was naked beneath it. He squeezed her breasts, his touch gentle but possessive, and assured her once again that he wasn't the butcher, just an ordinary rapist. The unease had been building in Graham Harris for the past quarter hour, a prickling at the back of his neck that he couldn't quite shake. He shifted in the leather chair, but the discomfort persisted. His gaze drifted to the 3 cameras arranged around the studio, and for a disorienting moment they seemed less like equipment and more like living things, hostile, intelligent robots watching him with cold mechanical eyes. The image was so absurd that he nearly laughed, but the tension in his chest kept the sound trapped. Anthony Prine noticed his restlessness. He asked if Graham was nervous, and Graham admitted he was, just a little. Prine dismissed the concern, assuring him that he'd handled himself well so far. Prying was the picture of composure, sophisticated, slightly jaded, utterly at ease in his high-backed leather chair. He looked like a slimmed-down Santa Claus with his white hair and merry blue eyes, and he seemed incapable of rudeness. But Graham knew better. He knew that Prying could lash out without warning, subjecting a guest to 3 or 4 minutes of devastating interrogation that could leave them humiliated on live television. Prying didn't do it often, once a night at most, sometimes only once a week, but when he did, the attack was brutal and relentless. That calculated unpredictability was what made Manhattan at Midnight so compelling, what kept millions of viewers tuning in night after night. The program director signaled that they had 20 seconds before returning to air. Prying told Graham to relax, that he'd be off in 15 minutes. But Graham couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong, that the night was going to sour for him in some unexpected way. The red light on the camera blinked on, and Prying addressed the audience, introducing Graham as a clairvoyant, a seer of visions. Graham agreed with the definition, though he quickly clarified that his abilities had nothing to do with the supernatural. They were the result of a head injury sustained in a climbing accident. Prying steered the conversation toward Graham's most recent case, the murder of the Havelock sisters in Boston. Graham shifted in his chair again, still sensing trouble but unable to pinpoint its source. He recounted the case as Prying prodded him. 2 young women, Paula and Paige, found dead in their apartment, tied and sexually molested before being shot. The police had no leads, and the sisters' parents had contacted Graham for help. He told Prying how he'd been taken to the sealed apartment, how he'd examined the scene but felt nothing. It was only when he was allowed to handle the victim's clothing, the blood-stained pajamas and robes, that his clairvoyant talent had burst forth, flooding his mind with images as vivid as anything he'd ever experienced. Prying pressed for details, wanting to know exactly what Graham had seen. Graham explained that the visions weren't like daydreams. They were far more intense, full of color and sound and texture. He'd seen the killer clearly, and though he couldn't intuit the man's name, he'd been able to give the police a thorough description. As it turned out, the description matched the building superintendent perfectly. Prying asked if the superintendent had been a suspect before Graham's involvement. Graham confirmed that he had been, but he'd had an alibi. He'd claimed to be at his sister's house, 80 miles away, at the time of the murders. His sister had supported the story. Graham explained how he'd found the killer by sensing that the sister was lying, that the murder weapon was hidden in her home, and that the superintendent had actually arrived hours after the crime. Prying pressed further, his tone still friendly but his questions growing more pointed. Graham felt the trap closing around him, but he couldn't see it clearly. Meanwhile, a second thread of awareness tugged at him. Something was happening beyond the walls of the studio, something bad, something that involved someone else. The psychic premonition was vague but insistent, a shadow at the edge of his consciousness that he couldn't quite bring into focus. The story continued to unfold, as Graham explained how he'd pinpointed the killer's actions, sensing that the superintendent had arrived at his sister's house 2 hours after the murders, not the previous evening, and that the murder weapon was hidden in the bottom drawer of her china closet. Accompanied by police, he'd confronted the sister and exposed her lies. Shocked by his knowledge, she'd broken down and admitted the truth after just a few questions. Prying seemed genuinely impressed, but Graham could feel the man circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. The conversation shifted to the butcher case, and Prying asked who had requested Graham's help. Graham explained that a sympathetic detective had reached out to him. He'd visited 5 of the crime scenes, handled some of the victims' clothing, and had gotten frustratingly little from them. The butcher was a big man, young, good-looking, self-assured, but beyond that, Graham couldn't get a clear psychic fix on him, and that bothered him deeply. Then Prying dropped the question like a stone into still water. How much was Graham being paid for his help? Graham replied that he wasn't being paid at all. Prying pressed further, asking if he'd been paid by the Havelock family. Graham insisted he hadn't, and then Prying struck, revealing that he'd spoken with the mother of a murdered boy from a Midwest town, a case Graham had worked 16 months ago. The woman claimed she'd paid Graham over $1,000 and he'd failed to find the killer. Graham's mind raced. Prine knew he didn't need the money. He came from a wealthy family and had a successful publishing business. What was Prine trying to prove? He explained that he had identified the killer and told the family where to find evidence. But the police and the mother had refused to pursue it because the man was a respected clergyman and the stepfather of the dead boy. The expression on Prine's face suggested this part of the story had been omitted when he'd spoken with the mother. But despite the revelation, Prine continued the attack, asking if the $1,000 had been a fee. Graham clarified that it was reimbursement for expenses: airfare, meals, lodging. Prine pressed further, asking if he ever padded his expenses, implying that he could easily take advantage of gullible people. Graham was stunned by the accusation. But before he could fully respond, something else seized his attention. A vision exploded behind his eyes, a woman with green eyes, clear and beautiful, terror twisting her features as she stared up at a gleaming blade. He saw the knife begin its descent, saw blood erupt from her throat. The images were so vivid, so immediate, that the studio around him faded to a distant hum. Then the vision shifted, and he saw the butcher at work, methodical, detached, as if murder were just another job. The blade rose and fell, and the woman's scream died unborn in a fountain of blood. There was no frenzy, no mania, just a cold, workmanlike efficiency that was somehow more terrifying than any psychotic rage. Graham was shaking when he came back to himself, his face slick with perspiration. Prine was asking him something, but the words seemed to come from very far away. "The butcher," Graham said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's killing again, right now." Prine leaned forward, hungry for the details. Graham saw a woman named Edna, a dancer. He couldn't get her last name clearly, but he sensed she was a performer of some kind. He also caught a fragment of the killer's name, Dwight, or something like it, and the sense that the police already knew him, that he was somehow familiar to them. Prine pressed for more, but the vision was fading, receding into the shadows of Graham's mind. He tried to hold on to it, to force out more details, but it was gone, leaving him hollow and cold. Edna Mowry was dead. He knew that with absolute certainty, and there was nothing he could do about it. Graham's outrage burst out of him, his body lurching forward in the chair as he confronted Prine's implication. The accusation was absurd. He didn't need money. He had a trust fund and a successful publishing business. But as he spoke, he realized Prine had already settled back, crossing his legs with the smug satisfaction of a man who'd gotten exactly the reaction he wanted. Graham's indignation, however justified, now looked like the desperate flailing of a guilty man. Prine pressed his advantage, noting that Graham's magazines had small circulations, conveniently ignoring the trust fund Graham had just mentioned. Graham knew Prine was lying about not knowing about the inheritance. The man was meticulous in his research. So why was he doing this? What could he possibly gain by slandering Graham on live television? Before he could pursue that thought, the vision struck again, more powerful than before. The green-eyed woman, terror twisting her beautiful features, staring up at the descending blade. He saw the knife begin its arc, saw her mouth open to scream, and then he was pulled under completely, the studio and cameras and audience vanishing as the violence played out behind his eyes. The blood, the methodical stabbing, the killer's detached, workmanlike demeanor, it was all there, vivid and horrifying. He surfaced from the vision trembling, his face slick with sweat, his stomach churning. Prine was asking him something, but he'd lost track of the conversation entirely. Then Prine's questions became more insistent, and Graham forced himself to focus, to push through the lingering shock of the psychic assault. He told Prine what he'd seen. The butcher was killing again, right now, a woman with green eyes. Her name was Edna something, maybe a dancer, and the killer's name was Dwight, or something close to it. The police already knew him. Graham sensed that. They'd interacted with him before, knew him well in some context. Prine was clearly excited, his earlier hostility forgotten as he pursued this fresh angle. He demanded more details, pushing Graham to identify the victim's full name, the location of the murder. But Graham couldn't hold on to the images. They were slipping away like water through his fingers. Edna was dead. He knew that with a certainty that made his stomach clench. The vision faded entirely, leaving him hollow and cold. He sank back in his chair, struggling to maintain his composure, feeling almost as if he were the one who'd been stabbed. The metallic taste of fear and bile was still in his mouth when Prine pressed him one last time for the address where the murder had occurred. Graham had nothing more to give. Graham could only shake his head, apologizing as the vision slipped entirely beyond his reach. The cold emptiness that settled in his chest was worse than the fear. It was the hollow ache of failure, of knowing that somewhere in the city a woman was dead, and he could do nothing about it. Back in his private suite after the show, Prine bypassed small talk and went straight for the bourbon. His manager Stevenson was already there, perched on the couch in clothes that would have been impeccable if not for the garish pink socks with their green clocks. A jarring note that Prine found almost offensive. Stevenson asked about his expectations. Prine admitted he'd been waiting for a call that never came, and he wasn't pleased about it. Stevenson tried to compliment the show, but Prine brushed it off, saying only the first half hour had been any good. Stevenson pressed him on whether he actually believed Graham Harris's psychic performance, and Prine insisted the details were too specific to be coincidence. The green eyes, the name Edna. They'd see it confirmed in the papers tomorrow. Stevenson wondered aloud if it was strange that Harris's vision had come at the precise moment Prine was about to tear him apart on air. Prine asked what exactly he was supposed to have been nailing Harris for, and Stevenson mentioned a money angle, but Prine admitted he had no proof of any wrongdoing there, which prompted Stevenson to ask why he'd gone after Harris at all. Prine's answer was chilling in its simplicity. He wanted to break the man, reduce him to a babbling fool. When Stevenson pressed further, asking if it was about power, Prine dismissed the idea. He explained that he humiliated people on television because most people were fools, politicians, poets, philosophers, all of them, and he wanted to show the masses that their leaders were no smarter than they were. There was a bitter edge to his voice that Stevenson found unsettling. When Stevenson tried to shift the conversation, Prine circled back to his own intensity, asking if Stevenson had ever gotten blind drunk or gone to bed with two women at once. Stevenson admitted he hadn't, and Prine criticized him for not reaching out for life, for not experiencing enough. Then he commented on Stevenson's socks, and Stevenson looked down at his feet, genuinely puzzled. Prine moved to the windows, studying his own reflection in the glass, grinning at the image looking back at him. The night had recharged him. Harris had brought excitement back into his life, a new purpose. He'd destroy the clairvoyant, and that knowledge filled him with a dark satisfaction. When he turned back to Stevenson, he asked again about the phone call he'd been expecting. He was certain there should have been one. Stevenson insisted he hadn't left the suite for even a minute, that the private line had never rung. Prine finished his second bourbon, the warmth spreading through him, and invited Stevenson to join him for a drink. But Stevenson declined, standing to leave. Prine poured himself a third glass anyway, and when Stevenson commented on how fast he was drinking, Prine explained he was celebrating the downfall of another fool. Back at the townhouse in Greenwich Village, Connie was waiting for Graham when he came through the door. She took his coat and studied him with concern. It was past 2 a.m, and he looked drained. She asked where he'd been, and he said he'd needed to walk, to think. She could see the strain on his face, the way the night had worn him down. She guided him into the study where a fire crackled in the hearth, then went to pour him a brandy. He needed to warm up, she told him, and he admitted the cold had been brutal. When she brought the drinks and sat beside him, they fell into silence for a moment, staring at the flames. He asked her what Prine's interrogation had been about, what the man was after. Connie reminded him that Prine was known for such attacks, but Graham pointed out that the host usually had a reason and proof to back it up. Connie tried to steer the conversation to a lighter note, telling him that at least his visions of the 10th murder had silenced Prine. Graham confirmed that the visions were real, so vivid They felt like being in the room, witnessing the blood and violence firsthand. He took a quick sip of brandy, as if to wash away the taste of what he'd seen. He told her the butcher had rammed the knife into the woman's throat and twisted it, one of the worst visions he'd ever experienced. When Connie tried to change the subject, Graham returned to his frustration with the case. He couldn't get a clear image of the killer, only waves of overwhelming evil. He was convinced the butcher wasn't a lunatic in the classical sense, no amnesia, no schizophrenia, no Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. If anything, he was a whole new breed of killer, cold and methodical, capable of passing any psychiatric examination with ease. Connie asked if he didn't sense mental illness because the killer didn't know he was sick, but Graham rejected that possibility. The butcher was fully aware of his murders, and he wasn't angry or excited when he committed them, just methodical, like a man doing a job. Connie shivered at the description, and Graham admitted he felt as if he'd been inside the killer's head. He had a chronic case of the shivers himself. Connie took his hand and tried to redirect the conversation, telling him he'd looked wonderful on television. Graham laughed at that, pointing out he'd been sweating, pale, and shaking. But Connie was persistent, and Graham let himself be drawn away from the darkness of the subject, even if only for a moment. Connie was persistent, steering the conversation toward lighter ground. She told him he was a natural for television, even for movies, a leading man type. Graham smiled at the compliment, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners, the lines on his leathery face deepening. He joked about giving up publishing and psychic work to go into films, suggesting he could be the next Boris Karloff or Wallace Beery. She insisted on Robert Redford, and he played along, calling her Marie Dressler to his Wallace Beery. They bantered about the old movie Tugboat Annie, wondering if the characters ever went to bed together, what their marriage had really been like. He was weak, she was strong, but in the end, he'd always come through when it counted. Connie pointed out that he could have been strong all along if he'd had more self-respect. Graham fell silent, turning his brandy snifter in his hands, staring into the fire. Connie shifted the conversation again, asking about William Powell and Myrna Loy, the glamorous couple from the Thin Man movies, both strong, both witty, both perfect for each other. She suggested that was who they could be, Nick and Nora Charles. Graham smiled at the thought, and Connie took the brandy glass from his hand, setting it aside with her own. She kissed him lightly, teasing, and suggested they could play Nick and Nora. He played along, asking about the dog, making jokes. When he slid a hand beneath her sweater, she kissed him more fully and drew back with a smile. She said she'd put Asta to bed, and he asked if the dog was asleep. She confirmed he was, adding with a wink that she'd drugged his Alpo to make sure he wouldn't interrupt. Then she told Graham they belonged in bed, and he agreed, calling her ravishing. She urged him to ravish her, and he promised to do so with pleasure. She studied his sleeping face in the dim amber glow, reading the map of his life in the lines around his eyes, and mouthed the hard-won toughness, the lingering boyishness that hadn't quite been erased. Kindness and intelligence sat alongside something more troubling, a deep-rooted fear that had taken hold years ago and never let go. This was the man who had once conquered mountains. From adolescence through his early 30s, climbing had been his religion. He'd organized expeditions to the world's most punishing peaks. At 30, he'd traversed Everest via the South Col. A year later, he'd tackled the Eiger's sheer face in a single push without fixed ropes. His exploits, combined with his looks and charm, had made him the most celebrated figure in mountaineering. Then came the southwest face of Everest, the most dangerous unclimbed route on Earth. 2/3 of the way up, he fell. 16 bones broken, internal injuries, flown to a Swiss clinic, expected to die, 7 months of recovery, and he walked out with a permanent limp and a new companion fear. The doctors assured him he could still climb lesser peaks, but when he tried, panic seized him within the first 100 feet. 3 attempts, 3 failures. The realization sank, and he would never again scale anything remotely like Everest, and the thought terrified him. That fear metastasized. It spread beyond climbing into every corner of his existence. He obsessed over his investments, certain his inheritance would vanish. He launched 3 niche magazines as a financial hedge, then anxiously predicted their collapse. Every headache or cough became cancer. Even his clairvoyance, the psychic ability that had emerged after his accident, frightened him, though he couldn't escape it. Sometimes the fear crept into bed with him, leaving him unable to perform, and that humiliation only deepened his spiral. 2 weeks ago, he'd watched a mugging unfold and walked past without intervening, something the old Graham would never have done. He'd come home and confessed it with brutal self-recrimination, arguing when she tried to defend him. She saw the self-loathing taking root and knew where that road led. She understood her own limitations. Her strength and independence had crushed weaker men before she'd nearly destroyed her previous lover, simply by refusing to be less than his equal. But with Graham, she saw something worth saving. She glimpsed the man he'd once been, and wanted to help him find his way back. Yet this version of him was fragile, and she had to tread carefully. A gust rattled the window, and despite the warmth, she shivered. The phone shattered the silence with its jarring ring. She snatched it up before it could wake him, but he was already alert, watching her. She passed him the receiver after confirming the caller was Detective Predusky, and listened as Graham took the call. When he hung up, he told her the news they'd found the 10th victim. Connie pressed for the victim's name, and Graham gave it Edna Mowry. The bedroom was a nightmare of violence. Blood had soaked the sheets, pooled on the carpet beside the bed in a dark, spreading stain, and spattered the wall behind the brass headboard. 3 technicians worked under the coroner's direction. 2 on hands and knees near the bed, 1 dusting the nightstand for prints, even though the butcher's gloves made that futile. The coroner traced blood spatter patterns on the wall, calculating the killer's dominant hand. Graham asked where the body was, and Predusky launched into a flustered apology. The ambulance had taken it to the morgue 10 minutes ago, and he felt terrible for not holding it longer. The detective's self-deprecation was almost painful to witness. He blamed himself for everything, down to waking Graham in the middle of the night. Yet Graham knew Predusky was highly respected. One of the best homicide detectives in Manhattan, his colleague said so without reservation. Graham assured him the missing body didn't matter. He'd already seen her in a vision, her green eyes, her death. The details matched nude, multiple stab wounds, a brutal throat injury, mutilation. Predusky hesitated to describe the mutilation, but Graham pressed. The killer had cut a plug of flesh from her stomach, a circular piece centered on her navel, and placed it in her right hand, closing her fingers around it. Graham closed his eyes, shuddering. No vision came, just a sickening certainty, the unshakable sense that this was precisely what had happened. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him, wished his clairvoyance could show him something useful like stock tips or winning horses instead of these horrors, but he couldn't wish the power away, so he felt compelled to use it, compensating somehow for the cowardice that had consumed him since his accident. Predusky directed his attention to the wall beside the vanity bench, where lines of poetry had been written in blood. He asked if Graham recognized it, and Graham admitted he didn't. Neither did Predusky, who lamented his limited education, only a year of college, too little time to absorb everything he should know. If only he were better read, he might recognize the source, might follow this lead. Graham suggested. The butcher might have written his own verse, but Predusky dismissed the idea. A poet wouldn't need to kill. He'd have words for his rage. No, this was too polished, too refined. Besides, it stirred something in his memory, a faint, elusive recognition he couldn't quite pin down. He crossed to the bedroom door, closed it, and revealed another message on the inside surface, 5 more words in dried blood. Graham hadn't seen it before. He would have remembered. Predusky noted that such messages weren't unusual in these crimes. Jack the Ripper had written to the police, and the Manson family had scrawled on walls. He wondered aloud what the phrase meant, what the killer was trying to communicate. Graham could only ask if they came from the same poem. Predusky confessed he had no idea where the bloody poetry came from. his shoulders sagging as he thrust his hands into his pockets. The weight of the case was visibly crushing him, and he voiced his growing doubt that he'd ever catch the killer. In the living room, Graham took a seat as Predjuski requested. The space was tasteful and expensive: textured wallpaper, plush carpet, velvet furniture, a glass coffee table with brass legs, chrome shelves filled with books and statuary. Sarah Piper sat on one end of the sofa, wearing a dark blue knitted pantsuit with Kelly green piping. She was striking, no older than 25, blonde and well-built, with gold earrings and an elegant thin watch. Her eyes were still red and puffy from crying, but she'd regained her composure. She expressed mild exasperation at being questioned again, but Predjuski apologized for the repetition, explaining that this was simply his method. He needed to go over things multiple times to ensure nothing was missed. It was a flaw, he admitted, one he wasn't proud of, but it was how he worked. Sarah gave Graham a look that seemed to ask if the detective was serious, and Graham could only smile in return. Predjuski asked how long she'd known Edna, and she answered about a year. They'd been best friends, in fact, and she'd been Edna's only real confidant. Edna wasn't disliked, just quiet and private, keeping mostly to herself. They'd met at work, at a club called the Rhinestone Palace, where they both danced. Graham confirmed he knew of the place by reputation, a higher-class establishment than most strip clubs. Predjuski's eyes sharpened briefly as he noted the connection on the prying show. Graham had said the victim might be named Edna Dancer. He'd been wrong about the surname, but not entirely off the mark. Sarah explained Edna's routine. She'd clocked in at 5 the previous evening, performed her act twice an hour for 7 hours, then spent her breaks in a black cocktail dress, circulating among the customers, hustling drinks with a cautious, demure style that skirted the edge of the B-girl laws. She finished her last performance at 20 minutes to midnight, and left soon after. Predjuski asked if she'd come straight home, and Sarah confirmed she always did. Edna had no interest in nightlife beyond what she endured at work. Her voice faltered slightly at the memory. She'd arrived at the apartment around 3:15, intending to share breakfast and gossip as she often did. When Predjuski inquired why she hadn't come directly after her shift, Sarah's tone suggested she'd had a date, a paying customer. Graham could tell from her inflection, and it saddened him. He felt warm, mellow psychic vibrations from her, a sense that she was a genuinely good person, and he wanted only good things for her. Edna had no boyfriend, Sarah said. She was between relationships, and when she dropped a man, he stayed dropped. Predjuski struggled to frame his question delicately. Clearly uncomfortable, he asked if Edna might have been a prostitute, though he couldn't bring himself to use the word. Sarah finished the question for him, unoffended, and admitted she did some light hooking herself once a week, maybe, with men she liked, who could spare $200. But Edna was different, she explained. She made $800 a week stripping and hustling drinks, saved most of it, spent only on books and her apartment. She didn't need the money and wouldn't have been interested. Predjuski pressed the point because it mattered. If Edna opened the door to her killer, he must have been someone she knew, even briefly. That was what puzzled him most about the case. How did the butcher get all these different women to let him in late at night? They came from varied backgrounds: housewives, lawyers, teachers, secretaries, a model, a sales clerk, yet he'd gained entry every time. The detective then noted that after each murder, the butcher went to the kitchen for a snack. Psychiatrists had described 2 types of killers to him. The first type, Mr. Meek, who sank into lethargy after the act. The second type, who grew more energized, eating ravenously and sometimes seeking out prostitutes. Their killer seemed to be the second type, except there was a complication. 7 times he'd eaten a genuine big meal at the scene, but 3 times he'd faked it. In the Lidstrom case, the 5th murder, he'd set out food but hadn't eaten any of it. The apple had been peeled and cored neatly, not gnawed, and tests showed everything had been put through the garbage disposal. He'd staged the meal to look authentic but consumed nothing. The same thing happened at murders 7 and 8. Graham found the deception deeply unsettling. If the compulsion to eat was part of the psychotic pattern, Why fake it when the urge didn't strike? Perdusky admitted he had no answer. His weariness etched in his face as he wiped it with his hand. If the butcher was insane, why wasn't his behavior consistent? Graham hesitated, then delivered his unsettling opinion. No court-appointed psychiatrist would find this man insane. In fact, without knowledge of the murders, a psychiatrist would likely find him saner than most people. Perdusky stared at him in disbelief. How could someone who carved up 10 women not be crazy? Graham held his ground, explaining that the butcher might be crazy, but not in any traditional way, something entirely new. This wasn't just a theory. He said he sensed it. Psychically. Perdusky pressed for more specifics, but Graham had nothing else to offer. Nothing beyond what he'd revealed on the Prine show, and nothing new since arriving at the scene. The detective speculated that if the killer wasn't insane in any traditional sense, there must be a connection between the murders, some underlying logic. But he couldn't see what that connection might be, and neither could Graham. The psychic usually found himself immersed in violent emotions and chaotic images when he touched something tied to a murder, but here he encountered only a chilling sense of cold, malevolent reason. He'd never had such difficulty reading a killer. Perdusky admitted his own frustration. He worked slowly, relied on luck more than skill, and this time, luck had deserted him entirely. He was beginning to doubt he'd ever solve the case. As they spoke, Graham caught sight of Sarah Piper, and a vivid image exploded behind his eyes, her face covered in blood. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him shaken. He tried to summon more, to force the psychic picture to expand, but nothing followed. Just that single, terrible flash. She noticed his stare and turned, greeting him. He forced a smile and admitted he'd predicted Edna's death earlier on television. She found it spooky, and he confessed he wished they'd met under different circumstances. She suggested they still might, and Graham warned her to be careful over the next few days. She assured him she would be, after what she'd seen tonight. Frank Bollinger's apartment was sparse, almost monastic. Cocoa-brown walls in the bedroom, bare polished floors throughout. A bed, a nightstand, a portable TV. The living room held only a black leather couch, a wicker chair with black cushions, a mirrored coffee table, and shelves of books. The kitchen was functional. He liked it that way. Friday morning, he woke at 9, showered, plugged in the phone, and made coffee. He'd come straight home from Edna Mowry's place, drinking scotch and reading Blake's poetry into the early hours. He'd fallen asleep reciting lines from the Four Zoas, and when he woke, he felt reborn, fresh, pure, new. The phone rang as he poured his first cup. Billy was on the line, using the name Dwight, a name Bollinger cherished, reserved for those who understood he was special. His grandmother had called him that, insisting Franklin was too ordinary. She'd raised him after his father left, and his mother found him inconvenient, and she'd instilled in him the conviction that he was set apart, destined for greatness. After she died, no one used the name for nearly a decade until Billy came along. Billy understood what it was to be superior, to be part of a new breed, and he had a right to call him Dwight. Billy explained he'd tried calling several times the previous night. Bollinger had unplugged the phone to drink and sleep undisturbed. Billy pressed about the morning papers, but Bollinger had just woken and hadn't seen them. When Billy mentioned Graham Harris, the psychic Bollinger still didn't understand the connection until Billy insisted he get a copy of the Daily News and meet at the Leopard at 11:30 for lunch. Bollinger stopped at a kiosk on the way. The front page featured a smiling photo of Edna Mowry, alongside bold headlines about Graham Harris's prediction on Manhattan at midnight. Harris had said the killer's name was Dwight, that the police already knew him. Bollinger's shock was visceral. How could Harris possibly know so much? Psychic powers? That was absurd. Yet the newspaper was right in front of him, and the details were disturbingly accurate. At the restaurant, Billy was already seated. The place was quiet at this hour, hours before the lunch crowd would arrive. They ordered drinks and sat in silence for a moment, the tension palpable. Billy broke it first, acknowledging the nasty news. Bollinger admitted Harris was incredible. But Billy tried to reassure him. Nobody else knew him by that name, and his middle name on his employee file didn't necessarily point to him. The police had no reason to suspect a cop. But Bollinger was worried. If Harris revealed one more detail, he'd be exposed. He'd never believed in psychics before, but now he had no choice. Billy had been right all along. "Apology accepted," Billy said, with a thin smile. Bollinger asked if they could reason with Harris, but Billy dismissed the idea. Harris wouldn't understand, he wasn't one of them. When their drinks arrived, Billy asked what Bollinger planned to do. Bollinger didn't hesitate, kill him. But he had no objections, not that it would have mattered. Bollinger was resolved. After the waiter left, Billy asked if he'd leave the body in the butcher's style. Bollinger saw the value in that it would confuse and upset people even more, since the previous victims had been women. He planned to do it tonight. Billy mentioned Harris lived with a woman young, likely pretty. Bollinger's eyes lit up at the prospect of a double-header. That would just add to the fun. The call came through, and Graham took it. Predski was on the line, apologizing for the interruption, even though he was the one who'd initiated it. He asked if they could be less formal, and Graham agreed. Predski had been trying to track down the source of the bloody poetry from the Maori apartment, couldn't sleep with it nagging at him. He explained that the first line was from William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, something he remembered from a literature paper he'd written 25 years ago during his 1 year of college. The second line, A Rope Over an Abyss, had stumped him, so he'd consulted a professor friend at Columbia, who passed it around until someone identified it as Nietzsche. The full quotation was about man being a rope stretched between animal and Superman. Predski noted the superficial resemblance between Blake and Nietzsche's philosophies. Both believed men could evolve toward godhood, but pointed out the contradictions. Blake was an optimist who liked women. Nietzsche was a pessimist who despised them. If the butcher subscribed to both, he'd be schizophrenic. Yet Graham had said the killer wasn't crazy in any traditional sense. The detective pressed if the butcher saw himself as one of Nietzsche's supermen. That was delusions of grandeur, a symptom of schizophrenia or paranoia. Did Graham still think he'd pass a psychiatric test? Graham held his ground. Yes, he did. He sensed this psychically. Press further. He admitted he'd never been seriously wrong, no worse than mistaking Edna Mowry's last name. Predski acknowledged Graham's reputation and skill but seemed uncertain where that left them. Graham admitted he didn't know either. Predski asked if Graham would spend an hour with a book of Blake's poems, hoping it might spark a vision or at least a hunch. Graham agreed it might. The detective offered to send a messenger right over, but Graham explained he couldn't get to it until tomorrow. He was behind on one of his magazines and needed to work most of tonight. Predski suggested half an hour, but Graham held firm. Tomorrow afternoon or evening, he'd make time. The detective thanked him, sounding genuinely relieved. He was counting on Graham. He said the butcher was too much for him, too sharp. He was getting nowhere, and if they didn't get a solid lead soon, he didn't know what would happen. Paul Stevenson entered Anthony Prine's office that Friday afternoon, his expensive suit and carefully chosen accessories doing nothing to mask his agitation. He had just discovered that Prine had hired private detectives to investigate Graham Harris, a fact that had him pouting rather than shouting, since he lacked the temperament for outright confrontation. Prine remained sprawled on the couch, newspaper in hand, projecting an air of casual disinterest that only deepened Stevenson's frustration. When pressed about the detectives, Prine insisted they were merely establishing Harris's whereabouts at specific times, not conducting a genuine investigation. Stevenson pointed out that ordering the detectives to avoid direct contact with Harris or his girlfriend constituted snooping, and that the costly 48-hour rush job seemed excessive for such a simple inquiry, especially when Prine could have simply asked Harris directly. Prine sat up, stretched, and revealed his real purpose. He wanted to know where Harris had been during each of the butcher's 10 murders. If Harris had been alone on all those occasions, Prine suggested, then perhaps Harris himself could be the killer. Stevenson found the notion absurd. Harris wasn't a killer, he caught killers. But Prine had already formulated a theory. He argued that Harris had spent years immersing himself in the darkest corners of the criminal mind, absorbing violence and trauma through his psychic work. A man already unstable could easily crack under such pressure and become exactly the kind of monster he hunted. Stevenson countered that Graham Harris was as stable as anyone, but Prine knew more about Harris's background than Stevenson expected. Harris hadn't been born to privilege. His real father had died when he was a year old, leaving his mother to struggle as a cocktail waitress while paying off medical debts. They had lived in poverty until she married the publisher Evan Harris, who gave the boy his name and his fortune. From nothing, Harris had become something, a celebrity in the climbing world, surrounded by fame and adoring women. Then the accident changed everything, leaving him terrified of climbing, and Prine suspected, terrified of returning to obscurity. Stevenson pointed out that Harris had inherited money, so poverty wasn't a concern. But Prine insisted that money wasn't the same as fame. Harris had developed a hunger for celebrity, and if he couldn't have positive attention, perhaps he had decided that infamy would serve just as well. The butcher's crimes were generating headlines after all. When Stevenson reminded Prine that Harris had been in the studio when Edna Mowry was murdered, Prine countered that Harris might have simply announced his next victim, rather than predicting her death through psychic means. The coroner's report placed the murder sometime between 11:30 and 1:30, and Harris had left the studio at 12:30, giving himself an hour to reach the victim. Stevenson stared at his partner, the implications slowly sinking in. If Prine could break a story like that, ABC would undoubtedly offer him a late-night talk show. Stevenson drained his glass and set it down with a note of finality. He challenged Prine directly, pointing out that the theory was built on nothing but speculation, far-fetched speculation at that. A man couldn't be convicted simply because he'd been born poor, he argued, and Prine's own childhood had been far harder than Harris's, yet Prine wasn't a killer. Prine admitted he had no proof. Not yet, but he considered that a temporary obstacle, not a permanent one. Across Manhattan that same afternoon, Sarah Piper packed for her Las Vegas trip. The regular customer who took her every 6 months paid well for her company, and she viewed the arrangement as a pleasant vacation rather than work. She was grateful for the week's leave from the Rhinestone Palace, especially after the sleepless, nightmare-haunted night she'd spent following Edna Mowry's murder. She needed rest to be at her best. As she worked, she caught herself wondering if something fundamental was missing from her emotional makeup. She'd cried for Edna, had genuinely felt the loss, yet by midday, her spirits had already rebounded, and she found herself looking forward to the trip with real excitement. She searched herself for guilt, for shame at her resilience, but found nothing. Experience had taught her that people were wired to move on, to let grief dissolve, and leave room for pleasure. Survival depended on that forgetfulness. It wasn't a pretty truth, but it was the truth. She was locking her third suitcase when the phone rang at 3 o'clock. A stranger on the line, speaking with a warm Southern accent, asked for a date that evening. He claimed to have gotten her name from one of her regular clients. She declined, explaining that she needed to rest for her morning flight. The man was persistent, offering to compensate her for canceling any other plans. She explained again. There were no other plans, she simply needed sleep. He pressed for her usual rate, and she quoted $200. When he immediately offered $300, she hesitated, but still demurred. When he went to $400, she tried to refer him to other women instead. He countered with $500. She laughed and warned him. He'd be disappointed. He assured her he'd made up his mind and couldn't be changed. $500 was nothing to a man who'd made millions in oil, he explained. He'd arrive at 6, they'd relax together, have dinner, and he'd have her home by 10 so she could rest. She smiled, finally relenting. He insisted on his word of honor that she'd be back early. She asked his name, and he gave it as Billy James Plover, suggesting she call him simply Billy. When she asked who had recommended her, he declined to say over the phone. They settled on the 6 o'clock appointment, and she told him she was looking forward to it. He assured her he was too. Connie's day at the antique shop had started slowly. She'd slept late and opened well past noon, but business turned out better than expected. She'd moved 6 matching 17th-century Spanish chairs, each carved from dark oak with bowed legs, claw feet, and snarling demon heads at the armrests. The buyer, a woman with a 14-room Fifth Avenue apartment overlooking Central Park, planned to use them in a room where she held séances. Later, alone in the shop, Connie retreated to her alcove office and started a pot of fresh coffee. The big front windows rattled suddenly, and she looked up, expecting a customer, but found only the wind lashing the glass. The winter storm was picking up. She called Graham's private line, bypassing his secretary, and they fell into their private exchange of nicknames. She wanted to celebrate the sale by taking him to dinner, but he explained he'd be working late to finish an issue. He was behind schedule, and his perfectionism demanded he double-check everything himself. She offered to come help, then to just sit and read while he worked, but he insisted she'd be bored and should stay home. She pressed anyway, and he finally relented, knowing he couldn't talk her out of it. She proposed bringing pizza and wine at 7:30, and he agreed. He mentioned they'd have company at 8:30, a police detective named Bollinger, one of Predusky's lieutenants, who'd called about new evidence in the Butcher case. Connie was relieved the meeting would come after dinner. Discussing the Butcher beforehand would ruin her appetite. They said their goodbyes. When the percolator finished, she poured herself a mug of coffee, added cream, and carried it to the front of the store. She settled into a chair near the show window, watching the few bundled pedestrians hurry past against the growing wind and the first scattered snowflakes ricocheting along the pavement. The warmth of the coffee spread through her, and she felt an almost physical comfort as she thought of Graham. Nothing could touch her when she held him in her mind. Not the wind, not the snow, not even the Butcher. She believed he'd give his life for her if it came to that, just as she would for him, and she was certain he would find his courage again without needing a crisis to force it out of him. Then the wind slammed against the glass, howling, plastering snow like spittle across the cold panes. The room felt institutional, long and narrow, with a brown tile floor, beige walls, and harsh fluorescent light. 2 metal desks near the entrance held typewriters, letter trays, artificial flowers, and the accumulated debris of a workday. Behind them sat 2 matronly women who managed to remain cheerful despite their drab surroundings. 5 cafeteria tables stretched end to end down the center of the room, their chairs all positioned on one side so that anyone sitting there faced sideways toward the desks. The arrangement made the space feel like a study hall overseen by teachers. Bollinger presented himself as Ben Frank, an architect's employee, and requested the complete file on the Bowerton building. The women brought him a staggering stack of documents: original blueprints, amendments, cost estimates, permit applications, final cost sheets, remodeling plans, photographs, correspondence, everything legally required to pass through the city's bureaucracy. Though meticulously labeled and organized, the file was a mountain of paper. The 42-story Bowerton building, completed in 1929, stood essentially unchanged. It was an Art Deco masterpiece, even more striking than the famous Channon building nearby. Preservationists had been campaigning to have it declared a landmark to protect its architectural features from piecemeal modernization. But Bollinger's interest wasn't aesthetic. Harris's offices were on the 40th floor, and that was what mattered. He spent an hour and 10 minutes absorbing every detail: main entrances, service entrances, emergency exits, the layout of 16 elevators, the placement of 2 stairwells. He pored over the electronic security system Minimal, installed in 1969, centered on a closed-circuit television guard station, until he was certain he'd memorized every flaw and loophole. At 4:45 he stood, stretched, yawned, and hummed softly as he put on his overcoat. 2 blocks from City Hall, he stepped into a phone booth and called Billy. He confirmed that the building could be penetrated, and Billy asked what he thought. Bollinger assured him the plan was viable. Billy offered to help, but Bollinger refused. If anything went wrong, he could flash his badge and claim he was investigating a complaint, slipping away quietly. 2 of them would be impossible to explain. They agreed to stick to the original plan. Bollinger told Billy to be in the alley at 10 o'clock. Billy hesitated, worried about waiting if the plan fell through, but Bollinger promised to call ahead if he had to abort. Billy agreed to wait no later than 10:30. Billy sighed with pleasure, savoring the chaos they would unleash. Bollinger confirmed that no one would sleep tomorrow night. Billy asked about the lines they'd leave on the wall, and Bollinger recited the Nietzsche quote he'd chosen, wanting Billy to appreciate his cleverness. Billy praised the selection. Then Bollinger mentioned the Blake fragment, and Billy laughed, understanding the double meaning. Yes, Bollinger confirmed he intended to lay hearts open and everything else from throat to crotch. The doorbell rang at exactly 6. Sarah answered, and her practiced smile faltered the moment she recognized the man in the hallway. Surprise and confusion colored her voice as she asked what he was doing there. He asked to come in, and she hesitated, still off balance. He complimented her appearance, and she self-consciously covered her low-cut bodice, explaining she was expecting someone else. He insisted she was expecting him, Billy James Plover, the name he'd been born with, though he'd changed it years ago. When she asked why he hadn't given his real name on the phone, he said he had to protect his reputation. Bewildered, she stepped aside to let him enter, then locked the door behind them. She stared openly at him, unable to mask her discomfort, and admitted she was shocked he didn't seem like the type who'd seek out a woman like her. He grinned broadly, genuinely amused by her reaction. She found his southern accent unsettling, and when he offered to drop it, she agreed it would be better. He seemed to enjoy the persona, feeling like someone new when he slipped into it. But then his tone shifted. He sensed something wrong between them and offered to leave if she didn't want to go through with it. She recovered her professional composure, apologized for her reaction, and assured him everything was fine. He complimented her apartment. She took his coat, offering to put his gloves in the pocket, but he insisted on keeping them. When she turned back around, he had a switchblade in his hand. She ordered him to put it away, but he only laughed, telling her she was the coolest woman he'd ever met. She repeated the command, adding that he should leave, but he just waved the knife and mocked her, noting that his other victims had said silly things too, but none had ever seriously believed they could talk him out of killing them. Until her. She bolted for the living room, heading for the bedroom where she kept a gun in her nightstand. He caught her by the shoulder before she'd gone far. She tried to twist free, but his grip was iron. He spun her around and shoved her backward. She collided with the coffee table, fell over it, and cracked her hip against a heavy wooden leg. Pain flared through her thigh. He stood over her, knife in hand, still grinning. She called him a bastard. He offered her a choice: resist and die painfully and slowly, or cooperate and die quickly after some fun. She told herself not to panic. She'd been knocked down before and always gotten up. She would survive this. She said okay, and stood. He unbuttoned her bodice, slipped a hand inside, and murmured appreciatively. As he leaned closer, promising to make it fun, she drove her knee into his crotch. The blow wasn't perfect, but it staggered him backward. She grabbed a table lamp and hurled it at him, not waiting to see if it connected before bolting into the bedroom. She slammed the door, but before she could throw the lock, he hit it from the other side, forcing it open a few inches. She threw her weight against it, trying to hold him back long enough to secure the lock, but he was too strong. She knew she had only moments before he broke through. Instead of continuing a losing struggle, she let go abruptly, catching him off guard. He stumbled into the room, nearly falling, as she sprinted for the nightstand. Her fingers closed around the gun, but he was on her in an instant, knocking it from her hand. It clattered uselessly against the wall and out of reach. A voice in her head demanded to know why she hadn't screamed for help while she had the chance. The walls were thick, and no one would likely have heard her anyway, but still, it would have been worth trying. But she knew the answer. Sarah Piper had never called for help. She'd always fought her own battles, solved her own problems. She was tough, proud of it, and she wouldn't break now. If her life was to mean anything, she would die the same way she'd lived: resolute, proud, and unyielding. She spat in his face. A man's voice, calm and controlled, came over the phone line to the homicide desk. He demanded a detective, refusing to give his name or location, and threatened to hang up if his request wasn't met. When the desk officer asked for his name, he identified himself only as the butcher and said he'd just killed a woman named Sarah Piper. He spelled the name carefully. He said he was calling to warn that he'd kill more people before the night was over. One of them would be the woman he loved, because he thought she suspected something. Then he shifted abruptly, rambling about Nietzsche and how women held men back from perfection, how all the energy wasted on courtship and sex could be channeled into thought and study. When the desk officer asked what men were meant to become, the caller grew suspicious that the call was being traced. He insisted it wasn't, but the caller didn't believe him. He said he'd be gone in a minute, that tomorrow everyone would know who the butcher was, but they wouldn't catch him. He was the lightning out of the dark cloud man. The line went dead. At 7 o'clock Friday evening, a full-scale snowstorm began to sift over Manhattan. Fine dry flakes streamed from the black sky, painting shifting patterns across the dark streets. In his apartment, Frank Bollinger watched the storm with deep satisfaction. With the weekend ahead and the weather turning treacherous, he doubted anyone but Harris and his woman would be working late in the Bowerton building. The snow felt like an accomplice, improving his chances immeasurably. By 7:20, he'd donned his overcoat. The pistol was already in the right pocket, not his police revolver, which could be traced, but a compact Walther PPK he'd taken off a dead man nearly a year ago. A precision machine silencer was screwed onto the barrel, yet the gun still fit easily out of sight in his deep coat pocket. In the left pocket, he carried a box of 50 bullets, prepared for any eventuality, though he doubted he'd need that many. He left his apartment, taking the stairs 2 at a time, eager to begin the hunt. Outside, the wind-driven snow felt like ground glass against his face. The night howled between the buildings, rattling bare branches. In the Bowerton building, Connie opened the pizza box on the conference table. Steam rose, filling the office with a spicy aroma. The wine was perfectly chilled. She'd made the pizzeria keep the bottle refrigerated until the pie was ready. Famished, they ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Eventually she asked if he'd taken a nap. He said he had, 2 hours. When she asked if he'd slept well, he joked that he'd slept like the dead, though she observed he looked like he hadn't slept at all. He quipped about his Rudolph Valentino look. She suggested he go home to bed, but he reminded her that the printer would be hounding him if the quarterly magazines were late. She pointed out that a few days wouldn't matter, but he was a perfectionist. She blew him a kiss. A thin skin of snow, barely a quarter-inch but deepening, coated the sidewalks and streets. Traffic on Lexington Avenue was sparse, just a few taxis moving too fast for conditions. The Bowerton building's main entrance sat 20 feet back from the sidewalk. 3 of the 4 revolving glass doors were locked at this hour, but the lobby beyond was warm and amber-lit, rich with marble, brasswork, and copper trim. Bollinger patted the pistol in his pocket and went inside. A closed-circuit television camera hung overhead, focused on the only unlocked door. He stamped the snow from his shoes, giving the camera time to study him. If the guard in the control room saw him facing the camera without concern, he wouldn't seem suspicious. A uniformed guard sat on a stool behind a lectern near the elevators. Bollinger walked over, stepped out of camera range and flashed his badge, identifying himself as police. The guard asked what was wrong. Bollinger asked who was working late, and the guard listed 4 names: Harris, Davis, Ott, and McDonald. Bollinger asked where to find Ott and Donald, both on the 16th floor at Cragmont Imports. The guard insisted there were only 4 people working late: Harris, Davis, Ott, and McDonald. Bollinger pressed, asking about maintenance crews, janitors, cleaning women, but the guard said none worked Friday nights. They'd be in all day tomorrow. The building engineer, Schiller, was on duty tonight, checking a heat pump somewhere downstairs alone. Bollinger asked how many other security guards besides the one he was speaking with. The guard hesitated, growing suspicious, but Bollinger pressed urgently, claiming it was an emergency. The guard slipped off his stool, and Bollinger pulled the Walther from his pocket. The guard blanched, recognizing the silencer and realizing this wasn't standard police procedure. Bollinger shot him twice in the chest. The impact drove the guard against the marble wall, where he stood rigid for a moment, as if awaiting measurement, then crumpled to the floor. Bollinger wasted no time. He checked the revolving doors empty, no witnesses. He tucked the pistol away, grabbed the dead guard by the arms, and dragged the body into the waiting area between the elevator banks, out of sight from the street. The guard's eyes stared blankly, his painted-on mustache frozen in a final expression. Bollinger rifled his pockets, finding loose change, a crumpled 5, and a keyring with 7 keys. He returned to the main lobby, but didn't head straight for the doors that would put him in camera range, and the guards monitoring the closed-circuit system might get curious. Instead, he slipped into a short corridor off the rear of the lobby, recalling the building plans he'd studied that afternoon. The guard's room was the second door on the right, standing open. His wet shoes squeaked with each step, and he wondered if the sound carried as loudly to the men inside as it did to him. He edged up to the doorway. 2 guards sat at a small table in front of 3 television monitors, but they weren't watching the screens. They were playing two-handed pinochle, complaining half-heartedly about their jobs. Bollinger drew the pistol and stepped through the doorway. The older guard, 50s, heavy, with a prize-fighter's lumpy face and Neely stitched on his pocket, looked up slowly, too slow to react properly. The younger one, trim and ascetic, turned to see what was happening. Bollinger shot him first. Faulkner. The name on his shirt clutched his ruined throat, toppling backward. Neely finally scrambled to his feet, fumbling with his holster, but Bollinger shot him twice. The big man pirouetted awkwardly, collapsed across the table, and brought it down in a flutter of cards. Bollinger checked their pulses. Both dead. He closed the door behind him as he left. At the front of the lobby, he locked the last revolving door and pocketed the keys. He sat on the stool at the lectern, replenished the pistol's magazine from the box of bullets in his coat pocket. He checked his watch, 8:10, right on schedule. Upstairs, Graham and Connie were finishing their pizza. He refused another glass of wine, insisting he had work to do. She admitted she'd been trying to get him drunk so she could seduce him, but he deflected the flirtation, promising tomorrow night instead. She joked that she'd be blind with desire by then. He quipped that love was a Braille experience. She winced at the pun. He got up, kissed her cheek, and asked if she'd brought something to read. She had a Nero Wolfe mystery. She asked if she could look at him from time to time. He asked why. What was there to look at? She pointed out that men bought Playboy, and he countered that he wouldn't be working in the nude. She said he didn't need to be naked to be sexy. He smiled and gave her permission to look, as long as she didn't talk. She asked if she could drool. He told her to drool if she must. He was pleased by her flattery. She was delighted by his reaction, feeling she was slowly peeling away layers of his inferiority complex. The building's night engineer, a solid-built man with pale hair and a lined face, was finishing a smoke when the figure came down from the lobby. He saw the gun first, and his question came out sharp with a German edge. The man with the gun answered in flawless German, identifying him by name as if they were old acquaintances. The engineer's surprise was complete. He hadn't expected to hear his mother tongue here, from a stranger. The smile on the other man's face only deepened his confusion, but the gun held his attention. He took the pipe from his mouth, wet his lips, and pointed at the weapon. The reply was short, chilling a confession of purpose. Then the shots came. The utility room was bare concrete, walls and ceiling rough, lined with equipment cabinets and junction boxes. 2 red extinguishers hung in easy reach. The man moved to the telephone company panels against the far wall, unlocked, their contents exposed. Circuit breakers, 24 of them in each cabinet, all still in the on position. Methodically, he threw them off, one after another, until silence pooled in the room. Across the hall he found the fire emergency box, forced it open, and worked on the wiring inside. When he was finished, he stepped around the bodies of the guards already cooling, already past caring, and tried the phones on the desk. Dead. Both of them. The lines were severed. He jiggled the cutoff spikes, but nothing came through. No dial tone, no connection. Whistling softly, he moved to the elevator. The control panel had 2 keyholes, one for maintenance, one for the lift mechanism. The third key he tried fit the lower lock. He pressed for the 5th floor, but the car didn't respond. So he went through the rest of them, shutting down 15 of the 16 elevators in the building. The last one he kept for himself for the 16th floor, where the 2 men were working late, and then for the 40th, where Harris and his woman were waiting. Connie noticed the change in him before he spoke. The rhythm of his work had stopped, and when she looked up from her book, she found him motionless, his face slack, eyes unfocused. His breathing was uneven, too quick. She set the book aside and crossed to his desk. He tried to dismiss it, a headache. Nothing more, but she could see the lie in his hands, the tremor he couldn't hide. When she touched him, his skin was cold. Then the truth came out, a vision of himself getting shot. She felt the floor drop out from under her, because he had never been wrong before, never once, and he had never seen himself in a vision, only strangers, only victims. Now he was the one falling, the one bleeding. He described the impact like a sledgehammer between the shoulders, the shock of it, the sight of his own blood spreading. He thought it might be the butcher. He didn't know where it would happen, only that it would be somewhere familiar. His office, maybe, or home, and soon. She listened, her stomach turning cold, but she held his hand and didn't look away. She couldn't afford to show her fear. Not now. Not when he needed to believe there was still a way out. The wind slammed against the tower, rattling the windows behind their drapes, and Connie pressed him for an answer. When would it happen? Soon, he said. Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow at the latest. She asked what they were going to do, and the question hung there unanswered, because he didn't have an answer. On the 16th floor, Bollinger killed the elevator before stepping out, leaving the cab idling with its doors wide open. The corridor was mostly dark, just a single fluorescent tube in the elevator alcove, and 2 dim red emergency bulbs at opposite ends of the hall. He'd come prepared. The pencil flashlight clicked on, a thin beam cutting the gloom. He moved right past 6 small office suites until he found the door marked Cragmont Imports. The flashlight went off. The pistol came out. It was all going smoothly, too smoothly. He was ahead of schedule, enough to have time for the woman after Harris was dealt with. If she was worth it. He pictured an hour with her, an hour to use her up completely, and the anticipation sharpened his focus. The door to Cragmont Imports wasn't locked. He stepped into a dark reception lounge lit only by the glow spilling from a half-open office door. He paused at the threshold, listening to the low murmur of 2 men talking inside, then pushed through. They were at a conference table, shirt sleeves rolled, ties off, surrounded by paperwork. They saw the gun before they saw him, and it took them a moment to lift their eyes to his face. He commented on the perfume smell in the air, a strange observation, almost casual, and one of them explained it was part of the import business. Then he asked for MacDonald, and the 2 men immediately turned on each other, each pointing the finger at the other. They were both lying, both terrified, and it was almost comical watching them squirm. Then Bollinger laughed and told them it didn't matter anyway, because he was also there for Ate. The man in the blue shirt went pale. Who would want him killed? The question hung in the air, desperate and bewildered, and Bollinger found it amusing, the sheer stupidity of these animals, thinking there had to be a reason, thinking anyone would need a reason to kill them. She urged him to call Pridjuski for protection, but he shook his head. The detective believed in his visions. Yes, but that wasn't the point. He'd seen himself shot in the back. It was going to happen. Things he saw always happened. Nobody could stop it. She challenged that fatalism, argued that the future could be changed. He didn't believe it. His certainty was absolute, and that absolute certainty troubled her more than the vision itself. This surrender of responsibility, this willingness to let fate carry him wherever it would. She pushed back, using the only argument she knew would reach him if the butcher came for him. He wouldn't leave her alive. The thought jolted him, shook him loose from his passivity. He finally agreed to call. But the line was dead. No dial tone. He tried again, jiggled the receiver. Nothing. They moved to the secretary's phone in the reception area, also dead. She felt it then, a wrongness in the air, a sense of something closing in. He tried to rationalize it, bad service, a breakdown, but she wasn't convinced. He pointed out the improbability of someone tampering with the lines in a building this size, all the cables buried underground. She countered that the butcher had taken risks before, 10 times before, and that was different. He argued, those were women alone at night. Here there were security guards. But the guards were 40 stories below. That was a long way. They decided to leave. She offered to grab their coats. He told her to forget them, took her hand, and pulled her toward the elevators. Down on the 16th floor, Bollinger finished his work in Cragmont Imports. The silencer was wearing out, the last few shots had barked like a dog, but that didn't matter anymore. The noise wouldn't carry to the street or up to the 40th floor. He sat in the outer office, reloaded the magazine, unscrewed the spent silencer, pocketed it. No point risking a barrel fouled with steel wool. He checked his watch, 8:25. Right on schedule. He left the office, killed the lights, and walked to the elevators. On the 40th floor, Connie pressed the call button. Nothing. The elevators were dead, all 8 of them. She tried to rationalize it, suggested a coincidence, a mechanical failure. He didn't believe it. His face was tight, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, almost mask-like in their rigid anxiety. They were trapped. The numbers above the elevator began to climb, 16, 17, 18, each new digit a step closer. Connie felt the cold spread through her, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Graham's voice cut through her paralysis. Someone was coming. She tried to tell herself it could be the security guards, but she didn't believe it. The numbers kept rising, hypnotic, relentless. 25, 26. She thought of other women. Women in blood-soaked beds, women with their throats opened and their fingers severed and their ears left on nightstands like trinkets. 30, 31, 32. Graham grabbed her, startled her out of the spell. The stairs. They had to get to the lobby. She argued too far, his leg, but he was already moving, shoving her out of the alcove, his fingers digging into her shoulder hard enough to bruise. She stumbled. He kept her upright, and they ran. Behind them, the elevator doors opened. In the hall, Bollinger called out, trying to sound official. Harris answered, his voice thin with fear. The detective moved closer, badge out, identifying himself as the man with the 8:30 appointment. Harris wasn't buying it, asked how he'd gotten up when the elevators weren't working. Bollinger lied, said he'd come up on one, kept advancing slowly, one step at a time, trying not to spook them. Then Harris mentioned the telephones. Bollinger pretended not to know, but his hand was already in his coat pocket, gripping the pistol. She put it together in a flash. The vision, the police knowing the butcher, the way this man carried himself. She whispered it to Graham. The butcher might be a cop. He realized she was right, the certainty hitting him like a physical blow. Bollinger kept coming, slow and easy, a big man whose face stayed in shadow. Graham told him to stop, but his voice had no weight. He knew they couldn't outrun him, not with his bad leg, so they ducked into his office suite instead, slammed the door, locked it behind them. For a moment there was silence. Then Bollinger hit the door with his shoulder, rattling it in its frame. The door shuddered under the impact, the frame groaning from the force. Bollinger's weight slammed against it again, and the knob rattled violently in its housing, but the lock held for now. Connie's voice was low, steadying herself as much as him. He had a gun. He'd get through, eventually. Graham didn't argue. He just nodded. He knew. Ira Prodewski pulled up behind a row of police vehicles that choked half the narrow street, their engines idling, lights still spinning though no one was inside them. He got out, locked his car and walked toward the apartment house. The snow was fresh, barely half an inch deep, and it crunched under his shoes as he scuffed through it. The wind bit at his back, pushing cold flakes past his collar, and for a moment he was a child again, 4 years old, seeing his first winter storm in Albany. A young patrolman stood at the bottom of the steps, stamping his feet against the cold. Produsky made some small talk about the weather, and the officer admitted he didn't mind the snow, preferred it, actually, to what was waiting upstairs. Inside, the scene was worse than he'd imagined. The woman lay on the floor beside the bed, her body twisted, fingers curled like claws, eyes still open. 2 techs moved around her, documenting every detail before they'd mark her position and move her. The detective on the scene, Martin, stood off to the side, balding and bespectacled, doing his best not to look at the corpse. Martin told him the butcher had called just before 7, and they'd tried to reach Produsky immediately, but couldn't get through until almost 8. Produsky explained. His phone had been off the hook, he'd just gotten up at 15:15. The graveyard shift was starting. The call itself was unusual. No clues about who else the killer planned to target. Nothing but what Martin had transcribed. And the pattern was wrong too. 2 nights in a row. 2 women who knew each other, who worked together. Produsky didn't think Sarah Piper had known who killed her friend, though. He'd met her, talked to her. She wasn't the type to hold something like that back. Open, honest, a good person. Martin mentioned her Georgia accent, and Produsky surprised him by confessing he was from the South himself, though he'd left too young to pick up the drawl. His parents hadn't had one to pass on. They stood together for a moment, looking at the body, at the technicians working over it like pale attendants at a funeral. Then Produsky blew his nose and turned away. Martin told him the coroner was in the kitchen waiting to see him. Produsky said he'd be there in a few minutes, wanted to look around first, talk to the techs. Martin nodded, asked if he could wait in the living room. It was a rotten job, Produsky agreed. The gunshot cracked through the corridor, the bullet shattering the lock and splintering the doorframe. Smoke and the acrid bite of scorched metal hung in the air as Bollinger shoved the ruined door open. The reception lounge was dark, empty. He found the switch, flipped it, still nothing. No one. 3 suites on this floor, and Harris's was the smallest. 5 rooms total, including this one. Not many places to hide. He checked the left door first, a short hallway leading to 3 offices. Editor, secretary, ad salesman, art department, all empty. He was calm, almost relaxed. The hunt was what he lived for. The kill itself was just a moment, a punctuation mark. The real pleasure came after. In the days that followed the tension, the wondering if he'd made a mistake, the sharp edge of fear that kept him alive and alert, and when enough time passed, when he knew he'd gotten away clean, that sense of godhood filled him like a slow pour of warm whiskey. The door to Harris's private office was locked. He stepped back, fired twice into the mechanism. The metal buckled, wood splintered, but the door still wouldn't open. They'd barricaded it from the other side. He leaned into it, pushed hard, felt whatever was behind it rock back and forth, something tall and narrow, probably a bookshelf. He worked it rhythmically, push and relax, until the barricade tipped and crashed, the sound of breaking glass mixing with the heavy thud of falling objects. Whiskey fumes bloomed in the air. He squeezed through the gap, stepped over the antique bar they'd used as a shield, and put his foot in a puddle of expensive scotch. The lights were on, but the room was empty. Another door at the far end. He crossed to it, opened it, found the dark corridor beyond. They'd slipped out while he was searching, doubled back into the hallway, used the time he'd wasted against him. Clever? But not clever enough. They were prey, nothing more. He was the hunter. He moved to the nearest fire door, eased it open without a sound, and stepped into the stairwell. The dim light from the landing above cast long shadows down the concrete shaft. He heard their footsteps echoing below, quick, frantic, amplified by the narrow walls. He leaned over the railing, peered down into the alternating layers of light and shadow. 10 or 12 flights below, 5 or 6 floors down, he caught a glimpse of the woman's hand on the railing, pale against the dark. Then Harris's hand appeared, gripping the same rail, following her through a pool of light and back into the shadows. He considered going after them down the stairs, but dismissed it. They'd hear him coming, scatter, and he'd lose track of them. Too risky. He needed to stay ahead of them, not behind. Their hands appeared again, still too slow. He tried to count the floors, 12, 13, 14 below, 33rd floor, maybe. He left the stairwell, ran back to the elevator, keyed it on and punched the button for the 26th floor. The stairwell stretched on without end, an endless descent through layers of purple dark and dim light. Connie felt like she was being herded down a long corridor towards something waiting at the bottom, the butcher as a hellhound, always at her heels. The air was cool, but she was sweating, her body burning with the effort. She knew they should be moving faster, but Graham's leg slowed them. For a moment, a flash of anger cut through her frustration at being held back, and then it was gone, replaced by guilt. She hadn't thought she could feel that way about him, not after everything, but survival did things to people. It changed them. The insight came sharp and clear. She understood his fear better now than she ever had before. He hadn't chosen this injury. He hadn't asked for the fall on Everest, and considering the pain he was in, climbing down flight after flight, he was holding up remarkably well. From behind, he told her to go on ahead. He'd said it before. She refused, her breath coming in quick gasps. Two of them stood a better chance than one, she argued, even as she knew he had a gun and they had nothing. He pressed her again, suggesting she could bring back help. She didn't answer, just kept descending step by step, the ache spreading through her back and legs. Then she voiced the thought that had been gnawing at her: the guards were probably already dead. How else could Bollinger have gotten past them? Graham pointed out. He could have signed in, left his name. She countered, and leave a trail for the cops to follow? A dozen steps later, he realized she was right. No help coming. They had to get out of the building. A moment later, a boom echoed up from below, a fire door slamming shut. They froze on the 29th floor landing, trying to listen over the sound of their own breathing. The silence that followed was wrong, too deep, unnatural. Then a voice from below: "Police, Mr. Harris." It was Bollinger. Connie's throat tightened. He asked if she was pretty. The question was casual, almost friendly, and that made it worse. Then he started up the stairs. Slowly, one step at a time. Deliberate. He wasn't in a hurry. He wanted them to know there was no escape, no rush, just the inevitable closing of distance. They climbed again, faster than before, but Graham's leg wouldn't let them keep the pace. 2 floors up, they had to stop. He bent over, massaging the muscle. She looked back over the railing and saw Bollinger 4 flights below, leaning over his own rail, gun extended. He smiled at her, said something about her being pretty. Then he fired. The shot screamed up the core, ricocheted off the rail, smashed into the wall above them, and caromed again into the steps overhead. She jerked back, screamed, and Graham caught her, held her. Bollinger called out that he could have killed her, but he hadn't. He wanted to have fun with her later. Then he started climbing again, shoes scraping concrete, slow, methodical, whistling softly. Graham was furious, the anger cutting through the fear. Bollinger wasn't just chasing them. He was playing with them, toying with them like a cat with mice. Connie asked what they were going to do. He had no answer. They couldn't outrun him, but they had to try. He pulled open the landing door, and they stepped out of the stairwell's white light into the red glow of the 31st floor corridor. He stopped to wedge the doorstop in place, his hands shaking so badly she wondered if he'd be able to manage even that simple task. But he did. He explained the mechanism to her. The rubber-tipped shank would catch on the raised sill, locking the door from the other side. She pointed out Bollinger had a gun. He countered that the door was heavy, metal bullets wouldn't penetrate it. She felt a flicker of relief, watching him take charge. Even through the terror, he was functioning. The door rattled as Bollinger tried to force it from the other side, but the stop held. Bollinger would have to go up or down a floor, find another way, the stairs at the opposite end of the building, or the elevator. That bought them a few minutes. What good were a few minutes? She asked. He didn't know. Would they ever get out of this? Probably not, he said. In Sarah Piper's kitchen, Dr. Andrew Enderby was already at work, a dapper man in his 50s who looked like he belonged in a boardroom rather than a blood-spattered apartment. He pointed out the kitchen table spotless. No crumbs, no stains. Another fake meal. The butcher had taken food from the refrigerator and put it down the disposal, then set the table to look like he'd eaten. Produsky asked why, and Enderby had a theory. He was a psychiatrist too, he explained. Had gone to medical school, trained in otolaryngology, couldn't stand it. Went back for psychiatry, couldn't stand that either, too many neurotics. So he'd become a police pathologist. The dead didn't talk back, didn't infect him with their problems, and his psychiatric training gave him insights other pathologists missed. Like the one he had tonight. The reason the butcher sometimes ate and sometimes faked it? There were two of them, two men, not one. Ira Produsky could only stare as the medical examiner presented his theory with theatrical certainty. Enderby insisted there were two killers, not one a conclusion drawn from the peculiar pattern of faked meals at some murder scenes. The first 4 victims had been followed by genuine post-killing binges, while the 5th had been staged, the food untouched and disposed of. To Enderby, that meant the second butcher was a different man, one whose stomach turned at his own handiwork. Produsky's attention wandered momentarily to the precise knot of Enderby's tie, a stark contrast to his own rumpled appearance. Self-consciously, he touched his collar, then voiced the flaw in the theory the kitchen details had never been released to the press. How could an imitator know to stage the scene without inside information? Enderby waved the objection aside, doubling down on his premise. The two killers, he argued, must know each other, collaborators in the same bloody project. The implication struck Produsky as absurd. 2 psychopaths working in tandem like partners in a business venture, methodically carving up women to create a composite monster that existed only in the public imagination. Produsky began to pace, his mind rejecting the notion even as he considered it. He tried to envision the scenario: 2 disturbed men meeting by chance, forging some twisted alliance, signing an unspoken pact to terrorize the city. It seemed impossible. Psychopaths were solitary creatures by nature, incapable of the sustained cooperation Enderby described. Enderby countered with the Manson family, pointing out that multiple killers had worked together in California with chilling efficiency. Produsky conceded the point, but noted the obvious difference: Manson's followers had been caught. The doctor acknowledged the delay but insisted the parallel held, leaving Produsky to grapple with an explanation that felt wrong even as he heard it. Connie tried a few locked doors on the 31st floor before finding an unmarked one that swung open easily. Inside the maintenance room, Graham located a light switch that revealed a cramped space filled with supplies, his attention snagging on the scissors he'd spotted on a shelf. He took them as a weapon, but his hands betrayed him, trembling as he turned the blades over. Connie stepped through a red door and discovered a platform suspended in an elevator shaft, the vast vertical space yawning open in a way that made her pulse quicken. She called for Graham, excitement edging her voice. This was their way out. He joined her reluctantly, still clutching the scissors, his expression guarded and uncertain. She was already thinking ahead, measuring the dark spaces between platforms, calculating whether the shaft could carry them to safety before the killer caught up. The maintenance room felt like a dead end, but this unexpected opening in the building's structure offered something more: a chance to slip away into the maze of cables and darkness, maybe even reach the ground before Bollinger found them. She held the door open, watching Graham as he stepped onto the narrow platform, trying to read whether his fear or his determination would win out. The platform felt impossibly narrow under their feet, a mere 18 inches of concrete suspended above a vertiginous drop. Connie and Graham stood on the edge of the elevator shaft, the immense void pressing in on them from all sides. 4 elevator cabs sat dormant at the bottom, their cables hanging like massive steel vines in the darkness. Across the shaft, other platforms punctuated the concrete walls at regular intervals, each one a tiny ledge jutting out over the abyss, connected by metal rungs that formed ladders along both sides of the well. The system was designed for emergencies, a way to evacuate passengers from stalled cars or for maintenance crews to access the machinery. Small white lights marked each door and platform, but beyond their glow the shaft dissolved into absolute blackness upward, downward. The darkness stretched endlessly. Connie found herself measuring the distance to the bottom, trying to calculate how long the climb would take, how many floors they'd need to descend before they could risk stepping out into the building again. Graham stared into the concrete depths, his voice thin and uncertain when he finally spoke. He couldn't believe this was the escape route she'd discovered. Connie pressed him, insisting the stairs were too dangerous with Bollinger watching, but the look on Graham's face made it clear he was already rejecting the idea before she'd finished explaining. She tried to reason with him, pointing out that the ladder would make the descent manageable, that Bollinger might not even think to look for them in the shaft. The fear in Graham's eyes was absolute. He couldn't do it, couldn't climb down 31 floors through that terrifying void. Connie felt her patience fraying. What else could they do? There was no other way out, no other option that didn't end with Bollinger's gun. Graham just stared at the darkness below, gripping the railing with white-knuckled intensity, unable to answer her question. Frank Bollinger was already moving, anxious that he'd lost too much time. He'd retreated back to the 26th floor, where he'd left the elevator parked, and now he was rushing through the dim corridor toward the alcove. His watch read 9:15. The minutes were slipping away too quickly, each second feeling like it was accelerating, spinning out of his control. He fumbled for the dead guard's keys in his pocket, but they caught on the lining. When he yanked them free, the keys spun out of his hand and clattered to the carpet, their metallic jingle unnaturally loud in the silent hallway. He dropped to his knees, pawing blindly in the darkness, the seconds stretching into an eternity before he remembered the pencil flashlight. Even with a narrow beam, it took him more than a minute to find the keys scattered across the carpet. Straightening up, he checked the darkness around him, suddenly wary. Could Harris and the woman be waiting here in the shadows, ready to spring a trap? He pulled the pistol from his pocket, listening, studying the dim shapes along the corridor, but the alcove's brighter light revealed no silhouettes. There was no one hiding in the dark, no ambush waiting for him. They couldn't have known which floor he'd left the elevator on, and they certainly couldn't have gotten down here in time to surprise him anyway. The 31st floor, though that was different. They might have had just enough time to set something up for him there, but it didn't matter. He had the gun, and they had nothing but makeshift weapons. What threat could they possibly pose? He activated the elevator with the key, stepped inside, and pushed the button for the 31st floor. His watch read 9:19. If he could stay on schedule, he'd have time to kill Harris and still enjoy 20 minutes with the woman. Whistling softly, he watched the floor numbers climb. The technician carried away the wrapped garbage disposal, leaving Predusky and Enderby alone in the kitchen. The grandfather clock chimed from the foyer, its mechanism running 5 minutes slow, and outside the wind sang through the eaves like a melancholy flute. Enderby shifted his argument, suggesting that if Predusky couldn't accept the idea of two psychopaths working together, he should consider that these men might represent an entirely new category of killer. Predusky recognized the echo of Graham Harris's theories. The psychic had been saying much the same thing, insisting the butcher wasn't insane in any recognizable way, that he'd pass any psychiatric examination thrown at him. Enderby was coming around to that view, even as he maintained there were two butchers. Predusky moved to the window, tracing the outline of a knife in the moisture that had condensed on the glass. If Enderby was right, his own pet theory that the butcher was a classic paranoid schizophrenic operating in a psychotic fugue would have to be abandoned. But he couldn't reconcile the idea of two simultaneous fugues, two separate men acting out the same compulsion. Enderby agreed, insisting both men knew exactly what they were doing. There was no amnesia here, no blackouts. Then Enderby dropped a bombshell. These weren't sex murders. Predusky's mind scrambled to process that assertion, especially given the rape that preceded each killing. but Enderby explained that the sexual assault was incidental, an opportunistic act that didn't add to their legal risks, since the murder was already the capital crime. The real motive lay elsewhere, something deeper and more disturbing than simple psychosexual compulsion. Enderby pointed to the mutilation patterns, or rather, the lack of them. The killers never focused on the genitalia, the anus, the breasts, or the mouth, the areas that truly obsess sexual sadists. Instead, the mutilation was generalized, almost theatrical, window dressing, Enderby called it, designed to impress the police and the newspapers, to create a terrifying public persona rather than to satisfy a private compulsion. The motivation was hidden somewhere behind that need for an audience. Frajewski stared out at the snow-swept street, trying to understand what Enderby was driving at. If they could identify that motivation, whatever the killers wanted to achieve, by creating this monstrous image, they might be able to anticipate their next move. Enderby suddenly grew excited, drawing a parallel to another case, Chicago, 1924. Two young millionaires, both in their late teens. Frajewski recognized the names immediately: Leopold and Loeb. Enderby pressed on with a Leopold and Loeb comparison, explaining how those two young millionaires had murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks, not for money or passion, but for what Loeb had called an intellectual exercise. They'd considered themselves supermen, the first of a new race, and Leopold had been obsessed with Nietzsche's philosophy. Frajewski immediately saw the connection. One of the quotes written in blood on Edna Mowry's wall was from Nietzsche. Frajewski struggled to understand how anyone could view murder as a philosophical ideal rather than an act of madness. Enderby clarified Leopold and Loeb weren't insane in the traditional sense. They were brilliant, with IQs off the charts, and they'd carefully concealed their grandiose fantasies from the world. If psychiatric tests had existed in 1924 as sophisticated as today's, they'd have passed with ease. They weren't driven by the kind of childhood trauma or psychosis that had festered in killers like Manson's followers, Starkweather, Speck, or DeSalvo. They were simply and terrifyingly sane. If the butcher was two men, Frajewski realized with a sinking feeling, then they were facing a new Leopold and Loeb, killers murdering to prove their own superiority. But Enderby sensed something more complex, something beyond even that dark parallel. He suggested Frajewski called Graham Harris, whose psychic abilities had failed to produce a clear image of the killer. Maybe the problem was that Harris had been trying to see one face when he should have been searching for two. Frajewski hesitated, unwilling to disturb Harris while the man was working late to catch up on his magazine deadlines. Enderby pressed him to make the call anyway, but Frajewski checked his watch and realized it was almost 10 o'clock. He wasn't even on duty yet. The graveyard shift began at midnight, but he'd been working through his evening anyway. As always, he barely had time to cook spaghetti before headquarters called him about the latest murder. Enderby shook his head in exasperation. As long as he'd known Frajewski, the man had never sat down to a proper meal. He needed a wife, someone to look after him. Frajewski dismissed the suggestion with characteristic self-deprecation, insisting no woman in her right mind would marry him. Enderby smiled and called him on it, recognizing the familiar pattern of self-criticism as a defense mechanism. Frajewski grinned at Enderby's observation, acknowledging that a few women had indeed fallen for his act over the years, though never the right one. Enderby suggested he settle for someone half-right like most men did, but Frajewski shook his head. He wanted more than that. Checking his watch again, he announced he needed to leave, planning to return around midnight when Martin would probably still be questioning the other tenants. Enderby sighed wearily, resigned to another long night of fruitless work, the same circus of dusting and vacuuming that never seemed to yield anything useful. In the elevator shaft, Graham's foot slipped off a rung. Panic seized him instantly, and he kicked wildly at the ladder as if it were a living thing he had to subdue. Connie's voice from above cut through his terror, her concern bringing him back to himself. He hung by his hands until his breathing steadied and the vivid memories of Everest faded. When he found a foothold again, he assured her he was all right, warning himself not to look down even as he continued his descent. His body betrayed his fear. Damp hair, beaded sweat, cold skin that prickled with awareness of the void at his back, a sensation as palpable as a knife pressed between his shoulder blades. On the 31st floor, Bollinger entered the maintenance room and spotted the red door standing ajar like an invitation. He approached cautiously, alert for a trap, listening for any sound beyond his own footsteps. When he stepped onto the platform, the door swung shut behind him and the shaft went dark. But when he reopened it, the lights blazed back on. The emergency lighting only activated when a service entrance was open, which was why Harris had left the door propped. Bollinger found himself unexpectedly moved by the building's design. This 42-story structure from the 1920s had safety features that modern skyscrapers lack these days. You could rot in a stalled elevator for days waiting for repair. The building's grandeur struck him deeply, its Olympian scale resonating with his own sense of superiority. He felt like a microbe wandering through the veins of a living creature, a behemoth beyond measurement. The architects who conceived this monument were his kind movers and shakers, superior men, and he felt a kinship with them that strengthened his resolve. He pushed the doorstop into place to keep the lights burning, then peered down the ladder. Harris and the woman were 3 floors below, moving quickly, clearly aware of the significance of that momentary blackout. Bollinger had no intention of killing them in the shaft that would ruin the elaborate scheme he and Billy had devised. They had to be disposed of properly to create the maximum chaos, to mislead the police and plunge New York into terror. He checked his watch. 9:15. Billy would be waiting in the alley, and Bollinger was determined to stick to the plan. Besides, there was something cowardly about killing a man whose face he'd never seen. He wanted to meet Harris head-on, close enough to see the fear in his eyes. The plan was to drive them out of the shaft without killing them, to herd them to ground where the elaborate scheme could be carried out. Bollinger aimed wide of the woman's head and fired. The explosion in the enclosed space was deafening, the bullet ricocheting off concrete walls as Connie descended the ladder, her mind struggling to process the unreality of the situation. She caught herself murmuring nonsense syllables, her stomach churning, her bowels quivering with the sensation that a bullet had already torn through her. Bollinger fired again, then a 3rd time. Connie looked down to see Graham frozen on the ladder, one hand on the railing, one foot suspended over the void, crucified between the ladder and the platform. He finally found the courage to swing onto the platform, and she descended the last dozen rungs too fast, reaching him just as Bollinger fired again. They hurried through the red door into the maintenance room on the 27th level, where Connie spotted blood on Graham's trousers. The scissors in his pocket had torn through the lining and gouged his thigh when he'd nearly fallen. Bollinger watched until they left the shaft, noting they'd exited 2 platforms down on the 27th floor. He hurried toward the elevator, but Connie was already insisting they go back up the shaft, a plan Graham found insane. She argued that Bollinger wouldn't think to look for them there, that they could climb a couple of floors and then use the stairs when he came back to check. Graham still thought they needed to go down, but Connie reminded him that Bollinger would have sealed off the building if he'd killed the night guards. Reaching the lobby would only trap them. She wanted to be certain of having a long lead before heading for the exit. So they went up instead. Graham's eyes, once wide with terror, had narrowed with calculation as the will to survive began flowering in him. He understood they'd only bought 15 minutes at most, but that was enough time to think of another escape route. On the platform, he insisted Connie go first, so he wouldn't knock her off the ladder if he fell, and she kissed him before starting to climb. Bollinger searched the corridor, checked the south stairs, heard nothing. He was about to give up when he realized they might have gone back into the elevator shaft. He found the maintenance room with the red door ajar and approached cautiously, but as he opened it, the sound of another door closing echoed from the depths of the shaft. He leaned over the railing, trying to spot them but saw nothing. Cursing, he went back to the south stairs to listen, then ran toward the north stairs. Connie urged Graham not to slow down, to use the railing to pull himself along. He preferred the ladder to the stairs. On the ladder, he could keep nearly all his weight off his bad leg. He forced himself to cover 10 steps in a burst of speed, but the pain was agonizing, and he had to slow down. Connie kept encouraging him. promising they'd switch back to the elevator shaft after just one more floor. Billy drove into the alley, his tires cutting the first tracks through the fresh snow. The service courtyard behind the Bowerton building was 40 feet long and 20 feet deep, with 4 doors opening onto it, including a large green garage bay where oversized deliveries were received. A sodium vapor lamp cast harsh light on the stone walls and the rows of trash bins, throwing sharp-edged shadows across the snow. There was no sign of Bollinger. Prepared to flee at any hint of trouble, Billy backed the car into the courtyard, killed the headlights but left the engine running, and cracked his window an inch to prevent the glass from fogging. When Bollinger still didn't appear, he checked his watch. 10:02. Snow swirled down the alley in dry clouds, but the courtyard itself was sheltered from the worst of the wind. On most nights, squad cars would have patrolled these poorly lit back streets, watching for burglars and muggers. But not tonight, not in this weather. The city's patrolmen would be tied up with accident scenes, and as many as a third of them would be holed up in favorite hideouts, drinking coffee or something stronger, ready to respond only if the dispatcher insisted. Billy checked his watch again. 10:04. He would wait exactly 26 minutes. Not a minute less, not a minute more. That was the promise he'd made Dwight. Bollinger leaned over the railing in the elevator shaft, peering into the darkness below. Nothing but platforms, emergency lights, and empty space. Harris and the woman had vanished. He was exhausted from the endless chase, his shirt soaked with sweat beneath his overcoat. He left the platform, activated the elevator, and rode to the lobby. On the ground floor, he stripped off his heavy overcoat and dropped it beside the elevator doors, then wiped the sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve. He positioned himself at the end of the elevator bank, out of sight of anyone approaching the street doors. From here, he had a clear view of both stairwell exits. When Harris and the woman came through one of those doors, he would be waiting. The thought brought a grim satisfaction. He'd blow them away the moment they appeared. Connie realized Graham had stopped and turned back to find him staring at something. He'd spotted a fire alarm box and was calculating the effect of setting it off. The bells would bring the security guards, or at least the fire department, and trap Bollinger between them. Connie pointed out that the guards might already be dead, and even if they weren't, Bollinger might not flee when he heard the alarms. But Graham was already thinking ahead, recognizing that the noise would work both ways, masking their movements as well as his. Hope flickered in him for the first time that night until he remembered the vision, the bullet in his back, the blood spreading across the carpet. Connie pressed her fingers to the glass, then noticed the chain that was supposed to secure a hammer to the alarm box was empty. Graham produced the scissors he'd found earlier, using the heavy handles to smash the glass. He broke away the jagged edges, reached inside, and jerked the lever from green to red. No sound, no bells, silence. He pushed the lever up and down again, frantic, but nothing happened. Bollinger had been as thorough with the fire alarms as he'd been with the telephones. Billy glanced back through the rear window at the green garage door, then at the other 3 doors. The time was 10:15. Where in the hell was Dwight? Graham held up the scissors he'd found, but Connie was lost in thought, staring at the pile of climbing equipment near the photographic backdrop. She pointed to it, her expression a peculiar mixture of puzzlement, fear, and amazement. Graham explained it was for a buyer's guide article, then his face brightened as he realized her implication. The equipment could be used as weapons. He picked up an ice axe, noting it was better than any draftsman's tool. Connie listened at the hallway, then returned to consider their options methodically. She outlined 5 possibilities. First, make a stand, set a trap. Graham was willing to try, though he knew they'd have to be clever enough to keep Bollinger from using his gun. Connie raised a more troubling objection. Neither of them was a killer. Graham insisted he could do it if necessary, but Connie worried he might hesitate at the crucial moment, and he couldn't resent her lack of faith. He knew he hadn't earned it. Second, hide. But there were no unlocked offices, and playing cat and mouse for 7.5 hours wasn't possible, not with Graham's injured leg and the night shift working 12-hour shifts until 6 in the morning. Third, shout for help from the 40th floor, which was useless in the storm. Fourth, throw furniture into the street to attract attention, but the wind made it impossible to control where it would land, and they might kill someone. That left number 5. Connie slid off the desk and went to the climbing equipment. Her eyes were wide as she explained they would rig themselves out in boots, jackets, gloves, ropes, the works. They would climb down the outside of the building all the way to the street. At exactly 10:30, Billy pulled out of the service courtyard. The snowfall had intensified dramatically over the past half hour, and the wind had become dangerous sheets of powder-dry flakes churned in his headlights like a dense fog. At the mouth of the alley, his tire spun on ice, the car slewing toward the far curb. He managed to stop just short of a parked panel truck, furious with himself for losing control. He was always careful, never reckless, and the near accident shook him. He drove to Lexington and approached the Bowerton building from the front. The lobby beyond the revolving doors appeared deserted, and he saw no sign of trouble. But something had gone terribly wrong inside. He studied the building, the sidewalks, the snow-covered street, finding nothing to reassure him. If Dwight had been caught, would he talk? Would he implicate Billy? He'd have to go to work tonight without knowing how badly the plan had failed, constructing an alibi that would hold up if Dwight confessed. He had to remain calm, thorough, diligent, as much like himself as possible. Bollinger knew Billy was gone now, the schedule destroyed. He might salvage the plan, but he doubted it. The situation had degenerated to this: slaughter them and get out. He wondered where Harris was, whether the psychic's clairvoyance had allowed him to sense the trap waiting in the lobby. He decided to wait 5 more minutes, then go after them. Connie pressed Graham to explain why the climb was impossible. He insisted he couldn't do it, but she countered that it wasn't a climb, it was a descent. He'd managed the ladder in the shaft, hadn't he? He argued that it was different, that she'd never climbed before, that she couldn't learn on the sheer face of a 40-story building in the middle of a blizzard. She reminded him that he still knew how, that he hadn't forgotten, that he was a strong man. But he pointed to his leg, the leg that had failed him on Everest, that still ached with every step. She turned away from the window, listening for Bollinger while she talked. She recalled how he'd once said that scaling a building was easier than almost any mountain, how he'd dismissed the Abercrombie and Fitch stunt as nothing special. He remembered saying that too, remembered the arrogance of his younger self, who never thought he'd be called upon to prove it. She gestured to the climbing equipment, the best gear available, and insisted they'd be perfectly outfitted. He warned her they'd die if they tried it. She countered that they'd die if they stayed. He searched for alternatives, but she'd already outlined them all. Hiding wasn't an option, not for 7.5 hours. She challenged him. Could he think of anything better? The pressure of time bore down on him. Bollinger would be there in minutes, and they were running out of options. He voiced his doubts about climbing out into the storm. The wind was ferocious, gusts up to 50 miles an hour at this height, a constant battle just to keep from being torn off the building. She pressed him about the ropes, the harnesses. He conceded the gear was there, but the cold was the real enemy. Her jeans would offer no protection. She might as well be naked from the waist down. She insisted she could endure it, but he knew the limits of human flesh. When she asked how long the descent would take, he admitted. He wasn't sure, an hour, maybe 2. He could see she was thinking of rappelling, that quick, swinging descent, and the thought of her attempting such a maneuver with no experience horrified him. He dismissed it as reckless. She told him she had the guts for it. He countered that she lacked the judgment. She backed down, agreeing to take it slow and steady instead, but he remained adamantly opposed to the entire idea. She cut through his objections with brutal logic. They had 2 choices: stay and die for certain, or try the climb and at least have a chance. He couldn't argue with that, and he hated himself for even trying. He closed his eyes, disgusted by his own paralysis, by his inability to face the danger and the pain. He knew she was right, but the thought of stepping out into that void filled him with a cold dread that made reason feel irrelevant. She sensed him wavering, delaying. She demanded he tell her the real reason he wouldn't go, why this was truly impossible. The question hit him like a blow. He admitted, with shame, that she was stripping away his dignity. She told him he had done that to himself, piece by piece, surrendering his self-respect, until there was almost nothing left. Her voice broke slightly as she spoke, revealing the pain it caused her to be so blunt. He wanted to weep, but the tears wouldn't come. He was hollow, a coward who had used the fall on Everest as an excuse to retreat into fear, to become comfortable with his own inadequacy. He refused to see a psychiatrist because he suspected he was more content in his fear than he wanted to admit. He told her he was afraid of his own shadow, that he'd be useless out there. She refused to accept that. She reminded him how far he'd come just tonight, how he'd conquered the ladder in the elevator shaft. He remembered the fall, the slipping boot, the harness biting into his chest, the rope snapping, the terrifying suspension in midair, the endless floating down only 300 feet that had felt like a mile. She painted a vivid picture of what awaited them if they stayed. Bollinger would kill him instantly, a single shot, but for her, it would be a nightmare of slow mutilation. The image of Edna Mowry, holding her own severed flesh, flashed unbidden in his mind. She told him Bollinger would cut her, disfigure her. The finality of her words silenced him. He trembled, unable to find a response. She made her choice brutally clear. Either he prepared them for the climb, or he would have to kill her himself before Bollinger could get to her. She didn't want to die, but she wouldn't let the butcher have her. He told her he loved her, that she meant everything, but she cut through his protest. If he truly loved her, he would understand why he had to do it. He confessed he couldn't. She gave him an ultimatum: prepare to climb, or end her life right now, because Bollinger would be there any second. A short while later, after checking the empty south stairs and confirming the time, he turned to the gear, letting the familiar feel of the high-quality boots ground him. They fit perfectly, and lacing them up brought a strange comfort despite the terror of what lay ahead. He found her a pair of climbing shoes that would have to suffice, though they were unsuited for the snow and cold. He wrapped her feet in thick wool socks and sealed them in plastic to keep them dry. They both pulled on heavy red parkas, his with synthetic insulation, hers much warmer with goose down. He strapped her into a climbing harness, a piece of equipment that would protect her in case of a fall, explaining that it would bring her up short. She was impressed, not knowing that he had arranged for her to descend on 2 independent ropes, while he would have only one. He kept that to himself, not wanting to burden her with unnecessary worry. They both had ropes coiled at their hips, and a variety of tools, pitons, carabiners, a hammer, a small drill hooked to their harnesses. Finally, they pulled on their gloves. Meanwhile, Bollinger continued his methodical search. He was checking corridors, stairs, and elevator shafts at intervals, but the building's shifting layout of shafts 4 on the lower floors, 2 in the middle, 1 at the top, slowed him down considerably. By 10:50, he was on the 15th floor with no sign of them. Frustrated but unable to think of a better approach, he headed to the 16th. Up on the 40th floor, Graham unlatched the center window. The panes opened inward with a squeal, and the wind exploded into the room like a living thing, screaming and swirling snow across the conference table. He leaned out, studying the building's face. The top 5 floors were set back, and just below that, a 6-foot ledge ringed the structure. The snow was so thick he could barely see the street lamps across Lexington. When he turned back inside, his face already numb, he admitted they'd suffer frostbite. She insisted they had no choice but to go. He assured her he wasn't backing out. She asked about protecting their faces with scarves, but he dismissed the idea the wind would plaster the fabric to their skin and make breathing nearly impossible. He rummaged through his desk, where his hypochondria had stocked a small pharmacy, and found a tube of lip balm. She questioned its usefulness against frostbite, but he explained that it would create a thin shield, slowing the loss of both heat and moisture from her skin, and the drying effect of the wind was as dangerous as the cold itself. She smiled, noting that there was some of the old resourceful man still in him. He attached a carabiner to the sturdy steel window post, then had her strip the plastic bands from a coil of rope. She expressed doubt about the thin line's strength, but he told her its breaking point was 4,000 pounds. He was surprised by how quickly and naturally the knots came back to him. 5 years of inactivity hadn't erased the muscle memory. He clipped the rope to the carabiner, cut and tied a 30-foot section as her safety line, then arranged the remaining length on the floor, carefully coiling it to avoid tangles. He tied the free end around his waist, standing with his legs spread and his back to the window, ready to perform a standing hip belay. He knew a seated belay was safer, but with her weighing 60 pounds less than him, he was confident she couldn't pull him off balance. He patted the sill and told her to sit. She positioned herself facing him, the wind and snow at her back. He pushed her safety line out the window, then arranged the 45-foot rope between them, one hand guiding, the other braking. He asked if she was ready, reminding her the ledge was only 30 feet below. She bit her lip, her voice weak, but she repeated back the instructions he'd given her. Hold the line above her head. Don't try to help. Find the ledge with her feet. Once there, she would untie herself from the main line but not the safety line, then tug twice to signal him. She said she loved him, and he returned the sentiment, though his heart was pounding with fear. She told him she trusted him, and he realized that if she died on this climb, he would have no reason to save himself. The guilt and emptiness would be worse than death. He was terrified, but he knew there was no turning back. He could only repeat his love for her. She took a deep breath and leaned backward into the void, announcing her departure with a grim joke. The moment she slipped off the sill, Connie felt the immense emptiness beneath her. Her throat tightened, her chest constricted, and her stomach churned with a sickening acid dread. She forced herself to reach up and grip the rope instead of clutching at the windowsill. The wind rocked her violently, stinging her face and eyes, forcing her to squint through narrow slits to see it all. When she glanced down, the 6-foot-wide ledge looked impossibly narrow, like a tightrope. Above, Graham braced himself, digging in his heels. He was surprised by how quickly fatigue set in. 5 years of inactivity had taken its toll, and each foot of rope he paid out sent new aches sparking through his muscles. The pain was the least of his worries, though. His back was to the office doors, and he couldn't shake the vision of a bullet striking him from behind. He wondered where Bollinger was. Below, Connie felt the rope twisting and untwisting, the nylon strands tightening and relaxing, turning her in a slow, sickening semicircle. She worried about the friction at the windowsill, the thin line fraying against the stone. Graham had assured her the rope would hold, but doubt gnawed at her. Bollinger continued his search, moving through the empty corridors and stairwells. Each door he opened revealed only darkness and silence, and the pattern felt like a metaphor for his entire life. A series of dead ends, a wilderness of doors that never opened onto the golden future he deserved. He was a vice detective, stuck in the grimy underworld, while lesser men held power and wealth. The subhumans had to be eliminated so the new breed could rise. The 30th floor was deserted, so he went up one more. Connie's feet finally touched the ledge. The wind had scoured the stone clean of snow, so she had secure footing. But with solid ground beneath her, the drop before her seemed even more terrifying than when she'd been dangling in space. She pressed her back to the building, untied herself from the main line and tugged the rope twice. Above, Graham reeled it in. She trusted him. She had to. But she was afraid he would panic when he reached the window, that he would turn back and leave her stranded. He stripped off his gloves and reached out to feel the stone beneath the window. The granite was cold and smooth, but before the wind could numb his fingers, he found a narrow horizontal crack. He kept one hand on it to mark the spot, while he took a piton and hammer from his waist, leaning out as far as he dared. Working by the alternating red and white glow of the aircraft warning lights above, he pounded the steel peg into the fissure. The position was awkward, almost upside down, and the work went slowly. When he finished, he checked the piton. It was solid, immovable. He clipped a carabiner through the piton's eye, then attached another to the window post above Connie's safety line. He untied the belaying rope from his waist and dropped it by the window. He closed one of the tall panes as far as the carabiners would allow, then drew the green velvet drapes across the window to conceal their escape route as long as possible. Bollinger would eventually figure it out, but every minute of delay helped. Behind the drapes, he picked up an 11-yard line he'd cut earlier, tying it to his harness and the free carabiner on the post. With no one to belay him, this would serve as his safety tether. He tied a figure-8 knot in one end of the 45-foot rappelling line and hooked it through the carabiner on the piton. He tossed the rope out and watched it hang straight, unobstructed. He knelt on the sill facing the drapes and eased backward out of the window, feet first. Just before he overbalanced, he closed the remaining pane as far as he could, then let himself drop 4 feet, hanging by his right arm on the safety tether. Memories of Mount Everest surged up, but he forced them down, swallowing hard against the bile rising in his throat. With his left hand he grabbed the rappelling line and took hold of the safety rope with his right. He pulled himself up, planting his boots against the granite at a 45-degree angle, toes jammed into a mortar seam. Balanced on 4 points, both hands on the ropes, both feet on the wall, he tested the piton by jerking on the rappelling line. It held firm. Convinced the anchor was secure, he shifted his full weight to the main line and released the safety tether. Now he was balanced on 3 points, left hand on the long line, both feet on the wall. If the main rope broke, the safety line would catch him. He reminded himself of that, staving off panic. He adjusted his position, passing the rappelling line between his legs, over his hip, across his chest, and over his shoulder. His left hand would guide, his right would brake. He was ready. For the first time since leaving the window, he truly took in his surroundings. The city rose around him like a forest of dark monoliths, their thousands of lights blurred by the falling snow. Manhattan stretched in every direction, left, right, behind him, but most importantly, below him, 600 feet of empty night waiting to swallow him whole. For a strange moment, he felt as if he were suspended in a paperweight, a tiny figure in a miniature city. The illusion passed, but the sense of his own insignificance lingered. He had been able to focus on the technical details of the climb until now, keeping the terror at bay by concentrating on pitons and ropes. But suddenly he was acutely aware of the drop, and the memories came flooding back: the fall on Everest, the harness jerking tight, the rope snapping, the endless floating, the impact, the darkness, the hospital rooms. He began to tremble. Sweat broke out on his forehead despite the freezing wind. He couldn't move. He was frozen, paralyzed. The fall from here would be twice as far as the one on Everest, and there would be no snowdrift to save him. He closed his eyes, trying to summon courage, but when he opened them, he saw Connie on the ledge below, motioning for him to hurry. If he didn't move, she would die. She had given him 18 months of love and patience, never criticizing his fear or selfishness, and he owed her everything. The thought of failing her was worse than any physical danger. He relaxed his grip on the line, told himself not to look down, and pushed off from the wall. As he swung backward and slid down, pain shot through his injured leg, but it was bearable. He couldn't rappel as boldly as he once had. The fear was still there, thick and suffocating, but he was no longer incapacitated by it. With each cautious step, each small descent, he felt the terror receding just enough to function. When he finally reached the ledge, Connie pressed close to him, shouting her congratulations over the wind. He replied, still cautious, still aware that they weren't safe yet. She pointed to the window beside them, suggesting they break in and hide. She raised her voice against the wind, pointing out that Bollinger would eventually find his office and see the ropes and carabiners. He agreed, but doubted the killer would assume they'd gone all the way to the street. She argued that even if Bollinger didn't fall for that, he wouldn't know which floor they'd stopped on. He couldn't blast open every door in the building. The wind howled between them, rocking them like toys, and snow stung his eyes so badly he had to squeeze them shut, tears streaming down his face. They pressed their foreheads together to talk more easily. She suggested hiding until people came to work, but he reminded her it was Saturday. She countered that custodial crews would still come in. He doubted it, predicting the city would be paralyzed by morning. She pushed further they could hide until Monday. He worried about water and food, but she pointed out that most large offices had coolers and vending machines. He admitted that was a long time, but she gestured to the drop beside them and made it clear that was a long climb. They agreed to smash in the window. Inside the office, Bollinger was about to leave when the drapes billowed. He raised his gun, but nothing was there. He pulled the cords, revealing the window and the carabiners on the center post. He opened the panes, leaned out, and saw the ropes leading down the side of the building. He was stunned. Above him, a muffled crack of thunder rang out. Graham got the hammer off his strap, and Connie grabbed his arm, shouting that Bollinger was there. He looked up and saw the killer leaning out of a window 30 feet above them. He told Connie to press against the wall to avoid making a target. She obeyed. A tongue of flame licked from Bollinger's pistol. Graham swung the hammer, shattering the window in front of him. Glass exploded inward. He worked frantically to clear the jagged shards, ignoring the ricochet that skipped off the stone inches from his face. Bollinger shouted something, but the wind tore his words apart. Graham kept smashing at the glass. When the last dangerous piece fell away, he shouted for Connie to go. She scrambled through the window into the dark office. He slipped the safety line knot at his harness. A shot was so close, it plucked at his sleeve, nearly throwing him off balance. 2 more rounds followed. He plunged forward through the broken window, bracing for the bullet that would stop him in the back. Inside the dark office on the 38th floor, glass crunched beneath their feet as they moved. She wondered how Bollinger could have missed them, and he reasoned the gale force wind and his awkward firing angle had thrown off his aim. The poor light and the wind in his face made an accurate shot nearly impossible. She realized they couldn't stay as planned. He would know which floor they were on and would be coming for them. They had no choice but to go back outside. She asked if he was ready to climb. He said he was as ready as he'd ever be. She praised his performance so far, but he reminded her he wasn't all the way down yet. She assured him he would make it because he wasn't afraid anymore. He insisted he was scared to death, but she argued it was a healthy fear now, not the paralyzing terror he'd felt before. He made a self-deprecating joke, but she could hear the pleasure in his voice. He was poking fun at his old inferiority complex, not succumbing to it. He had regained some of his self-respect. He opened the other half of the window and told her to wait while he set a new piton. He took off his gloves to work faster, despite her concern about his hands freezing. He checked above. Bollinger wasn't there. He crawled onto the ledge, stretched out on his stomach, and arranged a 100-foot rope into a coil that would unravel smoothly. He tied a knot with 2 small loops, hooked it through a carabiner, and screwed the sleeve in place. His back to the wind, he felt like strong hands were trying to shove him off the ledge. His fingers were already numb. He retrieved the safety lines they'd used from the 40th floor, jerking them loose from the overhead anchor, so they tumbled into his lap. He cut 2 5-foot pieces from one, tied one to his harness, and the other to a carabiner on the window post. He called to Connie, who stepped out of the shadows, reporting she'd heard nothing. He told her to come out. On his way to the elevator, Bollinger's mind drifted back to the first few nights he and Billy had spent together. They'd met at an all-night club and talked for 9 hours straight, feeling like the only 2 people in the place, connected by an understanding that went beyond words. The instant they met, something clicked between them, an immediate, almost cellular recognition that went beyond mere friendship. Bollinger experienced the sensation of finding a twin he'd never known he had, someone who understood him in ways no one else ever had. Their conversation that first night wasn't small talk. It was an excavation of the soul, each of them laying bare their most private thoughts about politics, religion, poetry, and sex. They discovered a staggering number of shared unorthodox beliefs, and within 9 hours, they had forged a bond deeper than any Bollinger had ever known. The second night, they returned to the bar, drank, and selected a woman to take back to Billy's apartment. What followed wasn't an ordinary threesome. They both engaged with her, sometimes taking turns, sometimes simultaneously, but neither man touched the other. Billy, despite his unassuming appearance, proved to be an insatiable lover who derived pleasure from postponing his own release, drawing out the experience until the eventual climax became almost unbearably intense. From the moment Bollinger entered the bed, he sensed he was being evaluated, measured against Billy's stamina, and he pushed himself to keep pace, even as the woman complained of exhaustion. The position that brought him to the peak of his arousal left a lasting impression. The woman knelt in the center of the bed, Billy before her and Bollinger behind, each of them claiming her from opposite ends. As Bollinger moved inside the woman, he looked up to find Billy's eyes fixed on him, wide, electric, not quite saying. He was unsettled but refused to look away. The eye contact triggered something hallucinatory. He felt himself rising out of his body, shrinking as he drifted toward those eyes until he was small enough to tumble into them, sinking deeper and deeper despite knowing it was only an illusion. His orgasm arrived as something more than physical release. He spilled into the woman at the exact moment Billy did the same into her mouth, and in that instant, Bollinger experienced a bizarre, powerful sensation that they had both expanded inside her, lengthened, until they touched at her center. His awareness of the woman faded entirely, leaving only himself and Billy alone in the room. In his mind's eye he saw them standing, their organs pressed together, a shared climax that felt profoundly asexual. He assured himself this wasn't homosexuality, nothing of the kind. Instead, it struck him as something sacred, similar to the blood brother rituals of certain Native American tribes, two individuals becoming forever part of each other. The experience marked a transformation from that moment forward. They were no longer two separate men, but one entity. Now his thoughts drifting back to Billy, Bollinger felt the absence keenly as he reached the elevator cab and activated the control. Outside on the building's ledge, Graham worked quickly despite the numbing cold that made his fingers stiff and painful. He secured the 100-foot rope to Connie's harness, then attached carabiners to the shorter lengths of rope he'd prepared. When she asked about the gear, he explained that the next level down was a smaller ledge, barely half the width of the one where they stood. He'd lower her the same way as before, anchored to the window frame, but there wasn't time to set up a full safety tether for that distance. She'd have to descend on a single line. He showed her how the short rope would serve as her safety line once she reached the lower ledge, instructing her to find a horizontal mortar seam, hammer in a piton, and attach the carabiner properly. Then she'd untie herself from the main rope so he could pull it back up and use it again. She took his gloves and handed them back after he'd finished speaking. He pulled them on, flexing his hands to coax back some warmth. He was going to lower her faster this time, much faster, and warned her to stay calm, hold tight, and watch for the ledge approaching beneath her. She gave no objections, only a terse affirmative. She swung her legs over the drop and let herself go. He spread his stance, took one last breath, and released the rope. The sudden weight nearly tore his arms from their sockets, but he kept his grip, paying out line as quickly as his frozen hands would allow, the pain in his muscles a distant concern compared to the more immediate task of keeping her alive. On the 38th floor, Bollinger hesitated at the corridor intersection, uncertain which office sat directly below Harris's. He narrowed it to two possibilities, both locked. He spent 3 bullets on the first door, shoved it open, fired twice into the dark interior, then lunged inside in a crouch. Finding the light switch, he confirmed the suite was empty, 3 rooms, all deserted. 5 stories below, Harris kept his hands on the rope, braced to catch Connie if she slipped before anchoring herself to the lower ledge. Muffled shots reached him through the wind close enough to make his stomach clench. What was Bollinger shooting at? The office behind him remained dark, but suddenly light spilled from the windows of the suite next door. Bollinger was dangerously close. Harris felt the cold certainty of his vision pressing in. Is this where it happens? The question lodged in his throat. The rope jerked twice Connie's signal sooner than he'd expected. He hauled in the line, his mind racing through the seconds he had left before Bollinger found the broken window. To reach the ledge below before Bollinger could draw a bead on him, he'd have to rappel faster than before, covering more ground on each arc. The windows along the descent would be a hazard. Now he couldn't afford to misstep and crash through one. The speed made precision harder, and the thought rekindled his terror. But maybe the urgency was a gift if he'd had time to hesitate. The fear might have paralyzed him completely. Bollinger returned to the corridor and fired twice into the second door. Inside the next suite, 3 shabby rooms, all empty, he went to the broken window and leaned out. The setback was empty. He brushed glass from the sill and crawled through. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face and down his collar. He lay flat on his belly, the stone like ice against his chest, and peered over the edge. Harris was only 10 feet below, rappelling fast. Bollinger gripped the piton, tried to twist it free, but it was solidly placed. The carabiner's gate was beyond his frozen fingers. He couldn't get a clean shot. The wind blurred his vision, the light was weak, and Harris moved too quickly. So he put down the pistol, rolled onto his side, and pulled out his knife, the same blade he'd used on so many women. He began sawing through the rope's loop at the piton, but the carabiner kept shifting, making the work slow. Harris pushed away from the wall, swung back, descended another 8 feet, and the rope snapped free. He knew instantly what had happened. Even as the slack line fell around his shoulders, his mind was already processing the emergency. The ledge ahead was barely 2 inches deep, not enough to hold him. He used his remaining momentum to launch himself toward the window, driving upward and inward with every ounce of strength. His shoulders smashed through the glass. He tried to thrust an arm through, to grab the center post, but his boots skidded off the icy sill. He slid down the stone, knees striking the granite hard enough to tear through his trousers and gouge his skin. His fingers caught the sill as gravity pulled him over, and he hung there, dangling over the street, kicking uselessly at the wall. 15 feet below, the setback where Connie waited was just 8 feet from the soles of his boots, but it looked impossibly distant. He hoped his vision of the bullet in the back was wrong. His thick gloves betrayed him on the ice-sheathed stone. His grip failed. He dropped onto the yard-wide ledge, landed hard, cried out in pain, and tottered backward. 1 foot stepped into empty space. Death pulled at him. He screamed, windmilling his arms. Connie, tethered to the wall, lunged forward, grabbed his parka, and hauled him toward the building. For a terrible moment they swayed on the brink, the wind shoving them both toward the street. Then she pulled him in. His foot found the stone again, and they staggered back against the face of the high-rise, safe from the concrete canyon. Connie pointed out that Bollinger had cut the rope but wasn't visible above them now. Harris agreed. The killer would be coming for them, and would cut the rope again if given the chance. The only counter was speed. They'd have to move faster than Bollinger could anticipate. He stretched out on the narrow ledge, his body parallel to the building's face, feeling the steady throb in his bad leg from ankle to hip. He knew that leg would fail him eventually, probably at the worst possible moment. He pulled a piton from his waist strap and asked for the hammer. Connie handed it over. He shifted position, lying at an angle with his head and one arm over the edge, and spotted a mortar seam even through his bulky gloves. He began hammering the piton into place. Below on the street, an ambulance crept along Lexington, its emergency lights casting red pulses through the falling snow, barely visible from this height. Harris watched it pass, then turned back to his work. 2 floors down, movement caught his eye, a window opening inward. No one appeared at it, but he sensed Bollinger in the darkness beyond. A chill ran down his spine, unrelated to the cold. He finished setting the piton without reacting, slid away from the edge, and stood. They couldn't descend here. Bollinger was waiting below, ready to shoot them as they passed. Connie's eyes went wide with fear. Why hadn't Bollinger come up to get them? Harris speculated that the killer assumed they'd already started down, or that he'd catch them as they moved along the ledge. Either way, the route was blocked. Connie was scared. Her eyebrows were crusted with snow, the fur of her hood rimmed with ice. Harris held her against the wind and thought quickly. The building was on a corner. They could follow the setback around to the other face, the one overlooking the side street. Bollinger could only watch Lexington from his window. Connie realized the logic. He'd wait there for minutes, expecting them to appear, then waste time searching the floor. They'd gain precious distance. She unhooked her safety tether from the window post, ready to move. At the open window on the 31st floor, Bollinger waited, anticipating the moment the woman would descend past him on the rope. The thought of shooting her as she swung into his line of fire excited him. He could already picture her falling away into the night. Killing her would shatter Harris emotionally, leaving him helpless and slow, and then Bollinger could finish him cleanly, salvage the plan he and Billy had devised. While he waited, his mind drifted back to that second night with Billy. After the whore had left, they'd eaten with the same intensity they'd brought to the bed: salads, steaks, bacon, eggs, toast, and a great deal of scotch. At midnight, over brandy, Bollinger had spoken about his grandmother and the years he'd spent with her. Billy had commented on her calling him Dwight. He liked the name. Bollinger noticed Billy's accent and asked about it. Billy explained he'd been born in the South and had deliberately lost his accent through voice lessons because Northerners didn't take Southerners seriously. He suggested calling Bollinger Dwight, claiming he was closer to him than anyone had been since his grandmother. Bollinger agreed. Billy then asked Bollinger to call him by his birth name, Billy James Plover, which he'd changed years ago when he went north to college. In those days, Ivy League professors had looked down on Southern names and drawls, but an Anglo-Saxon name like Franklin Dwight Bollinger commanded respect. Billy had dropped his Southern identity the same day he'd changed his name, and his luck improved immediately. But he wanted Bollinger to use that old name between them because they were special, different from other people. They were supermen, as Nietzsche had meant not comic book heroes, but something far more significant. Bollinger admitted he wasn't familiar with Nietzsche's work, and Billy offered to lend him a book. Bollinger waited, but neither Harris nor the woman appeared. He'd wasted too much time already. He'd have to go after them. On the side of the building, Connie drove a piton into a mortar seam and attached her safety tether, then freed herself from the main line. Graham reeled it up immediately. This face of the building was easier to climb than Lexington Avenue, not because there were more ledges or footholds, but because the wind was gentler here. The snowflakes felt like snowflakes, not tiny bullets, and the cold didn't bite through her jeans the way it had before. They descended 10 floors, she and Graham 5 since spotting Bollinger at the window. The 28th floor setback was behind them. Below that, only one more real ledge existed, at the 6th floor, 330 feet down. But at the 23rd level, an 18-inch decorative ledge carved into Art Deco grape clusters provided a temporary perch. Graham had lowered her to it, and was now rappelling down to join her. She watched him descend through the snow, moving with a spider's grace. In seconds, he was beside her. She handed him the hammer, and he set 2 pitons in the wall between windows, breathing hard, mist pluming from his mouth. He assured her he was fine, then sidled along the ledge without a safety line, his back to the street, hands flat against the stone. He moved through miniature snowdrifts and patches of brittle ice, stopping past the next window to drive in another piton. She wanted to call out, ask what he was doing, but she was afraid of distracting him. He returned inch by inch, and snapped his safety harness to one of the first pitons. When she asked what all that was for, he explained, they were both going to rappel down on separate ropes. She balked, not her. She couldn't do it, but he insisted she could and would. He'd been doing a body rappel. She'd learn a seat rappel, which was safer and easier. He retrieved the 100-foot line from above, pulling the knot loose, and caught the rope as it snaked down. After checking it for wear, he tied it off and snapped a carabiner to the free piton. Connie pointed out they couldn't rappel all the way to the street. The ropes weren't long enough. He corrected her. They'd go just 5 floors at a time, bracing on window ledges. She couldn't imagine balancing on a 2-inch sill, but he assured her it could be done. She'd still have her left hand on the line, her right hand would smash the window panes. Then she'd attach her safety tether, snap a carabiner to the center post, take her weight off the main line, and tug it free of the overhead knot just as he'd done. She'd catch the falling rope and tie it to the new carabiner. Then she'd unhook her safety line and rappel down another 5 floors, repeating the process. He explained. They'd repeat the entire routine 5 floors at a time, all the way to the street. She admitted she didn't know how to tie the knot that could be jerked loose from below, so he showed her. She leaned close, squinting in the dim light, and practiced tying it several times until she was certain she'd remember. Next, he looped a sling around her hips and through her crotch, joining the ends with a carabiner. She'd gripped the main line and tried to sound calm, but her voice betrayed her fear. Then they heard a muffled gunshot, then another, very close. Inside the building, somewhere on the 23rd floor. Bollinger had found his way into an office overlooking the side street. Harris heard the window latch rattling to his right. He moved immediately, turning away from the danger toward Lexington Avenue. Without a safety line, he walked the narrow ledge like a tightrope, each foot placed directly in front of the other, 50 feet to the corner. If they made the turn, they'd be out of the line of fire at least for a few minutes, but those minutes would be precious. He wanted to look back for Connie but didn't dare. He heard Bollinger shouting, then shots cracked through the darkness. He walked faster, too fast, his feet slipping on snow-sheathed stone, 25 feet to the corner. 20. Another shot. He felt the fourth bullet before he heard it ripping through his left sleeve, searing his arm. The impact made him stumble, the street spinning wildly below as he pawed helplessly at the wall. His boots slid on ice, and he shouted something meaningless. Half a dozen steps later, he regained his balance, amazed he hadn't fallen. There was no pain at first, just numbness from shoulder to fingertips. He wondered if he'd been mortally wounded, but realized a direct hit would have pitched him off the ledge. The wound would hurt soon enough, but it wouldn't kill him. 15 feet, 10 feet, dizzy, legs weak, shock. Another shot, farther away now. At the corner, as he edged onto the Lexington Avenue face where the wind wrenched at him, he glanced back. The ledge was empty. Connie was gone. Connie hung 4 or 5 yards below the 33rd floor ledge, swinging slightly over the void, unable to look down. Her arms were extended above her, fingers gripping the nylon rope, but the strain had numbed them so badly she couldn't be sure she was holding on tightly enough. Moments ago, without realizing it, she'd relaxed her hands and slid 2 yards before catching herself. There were no toe holds. She stared at the ledge above, expecting Bollinger to appear. When he'd opened the window on her right and leaned out with the pistol, she'd known he was too close to miss. She couldn't follow Graham toward Lexington. Bollinger would shoot her in the back. Instead, she'd gripped the main line and tried to time her jump just before he fired. Her timing was perfect. She'd dropped into the void as the shot came, so he must have thought he'd hit her. She prayed he wouldn't look over the edge and see her dangling there. Worried about Graham, she knew he hadn't fallen past her, so he was still up on the ledge, but he might be wounded. Whether he was hurt or not, her life depended on him coming back. She couldn't rappel, couldn't secure her position, couldn't do anything but hang there, and she wouldn't be able to do even that much longer. She refused to die. Even if Graham were already dead, she refused to follow. She loved him more than she'd ever loved anyone, but she cherished life itself, the small daily pleasures, the routine comforts. Her love of life was what had drawn Graham to her, what made her right for him. To Connie, the only obscenity was the grave. 15 feet above, someone moved in the light from the open window. Her heart seized Bollinger, but Graham's face appeared in the shadows. He saw her, and was stunned. He'd expected to find her body on the street below. Grinning, he began to reel her up. When she reached the ledge, he pulled her close, hugging her fiercely, and for a moment they were unaware of the drop beside them. He was elated. She was alive. She asked where Bollinger was. Graham guessed the killer had gone to look for him on the Lexington side of the building. Behind Graham, the office window was still lit, but there was no sign of Bollinger. He understood that Bollinger must believe she was dead because he'd thought so too. Then he noticed her staring at his arm. He explained he'd been shot, and though it hurt and felt stiff, the wound was shallow. The bullet had cauterized it. He demonstrated he could still move his hand, insisting he could climb. She argued he shouldn't, but he pointed out they had no choice. When she suggested using the stairs, he dismissed the idea Bollinger would check there next, and they'd be trapped. Their only option was to walk the ledge to the corner, wait for Bollinger to search the Lexington face, then rappel down once he'd moved on. She touched his wounded arm and asked if this was the bullet in the back he'd foreseen. He said no. Bollinger, meanwhile, had moved to another office overlooking Lexington and fired twice into the lock. His thoughts drifted back to his conversation with Billy about chaos and supermen. Billy had argued that only in the midst of Armageddon could men like them ascend to power. Rather than wait for nuclear war to destroy what they should inherit, they could generate chaos themselves. Billy had suggested using the Boston Strangler as a model not because DeSalvo was one of them, but because his murders had nearly thrown Boston into panic. They could do the same in Manhattan, on a much larger scale, 100 or 200 women killed brutally, then a shift to killing men, each murder attributed to a fictitious militant feminist group. The media frenzy would inspire imitators, creating a legion of copycat killers. Once factional violence erupted, black versus white, liberal versus conservative, men versus women, it would escalate endlessly, spreading chaos through the entire country. Bollinger was beginning to see Billy's point. In a city as divided as New York, they could turn every group against every other group. Billy had argued that with careful planning, they could generate enough chaos to bring about martial law and still have chaos persist, just as Northern Ireland had endured years of violence despite soldiers on every corner. Bollinger had doubted it would spread to other cities, but Billy insisted the media coverage alone would inspire imitators nationwide. At minimum, New York would be in turmoil, and voters would turn to a tough-talking mayor with new ideas. Billy pointed out, they could elect one of their own kind to that office, using the mayoralty as a stepping stone to the presidency. Bollinger questioned who that would be. They only knew each other. Billy suggested himself, claiming he had a good base for a campaign. Bollinger considered it, and admitted he'd have a fair chance. Billy pressed further. If they planned the chaos, they could also plan to run their man in its wake, giving him an inside track. Bollinger asked about the killing, the sheer scale of it. Billy asked if he'd ever killed before. Bollinger admitted to a pimp, 2 drug pushers, and a whore no one knew about. Killing hadn't disturbed him. They were scum. Billy agreed. They'd be killing scum, inferiors, animals. Bollinger wondered if they could get away with it. Billy pointed out that cops look for known criminals, mental patients, radicals, people with motives. They had a motive, but no one would ever figure it out. Bollinger began to see the possibility. Billy quoted Leopold. The Superman is not liable for anything he may do, except for the one crime that it is possible for him to commit to make a mistake. Bollinger asked if Billy was truly committed to the plan. Billy asked if he was. Bollinger confirmed they'd start with women. The memory of that conversation with Billy surged through Bollinger as he leaned from the window. The pact they'd made, the shared vision of chaos and dissent. But the ledge was empty. Harris had vanished, and the rope that should have been anchored to the piton was gone. He crawled onto the sill, leaning perilously far over the edge, scanning the snow-blanketed street below. Nothing, no twisted body, no dark stains spreading across the white, just the clean, undisturbed sheen of fresh powder. She hadn't fallen. His shot had missed. Fury ignited in his chest, hot and blinding. Why wouldn't they just die? He stumbled back inside, the wind's howl swallowed by the slam of the window frame, and took the corridor at a run toward the stairwell. On the side of the building, 23 stories up, Connie clung to the rope. The drop yawned beneath her like a bottomless pit, and she wished she could seal her eyes against it. But she couldn't. She had to see. She recited Graham's instructions like a prayer, right hand behind, left in front, right to brake, left to guide, feet spread against the stone. Then she pushed away. The sensation was visceral, like stepping off a cliff by choice. She gasped, the air stolen from her lungs. Swinging outward, she realized her left hand was strangling the rope. She forced herself to relax, and the line slid through her grip too fast. She braked hard, jolting to a stop. Her legs weren't straight. They buckled. She twisted, shoulders slamming into granite with a shock that rattled her teeth. The pain was sharp, but not bone-shattering. She held on, feet scrambling for purchase, and somehow found her position again. She shook off the daze, glanced left. Graham was 3 yards away, steady, watching. She nodded. "I'm okay," then pushed off again. This time, everything clicked. The rhythm came naturally. Graham allowed himself a grin as Connie found her stride. She was learning fast, her raw determination carrying her where skill hadn't yet caught up. He saw Nick Charles in her grit, and something deeper too, a toughness that reminded him of Nora. When she had the technique down well enough, he launched himself from the wall. He descended faster than she did, reaching the 18th floor ahead. He braced on the thin windowsill, smashed both panes with his fist, and anchored a snap link to the center post. Then he pulled the main line free from above, caught it, tied it to the carabiner in front of him, and positioned himself for the next rappel. 9 feet away, Connie mirrored his movements. He pushed into the void. The fear was still there, a low thrum in his chest, but it no longer owned him. It had shrunk to something manageable, something that sharpened rather than paralyzed. He marveled at how quickly the old skills had returned, how naturally his body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. His left arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed it, fingers stiff but functional. His bad leg pulsed with a dull, constant ache, but it didn't slow him. He hit the 17th floor. One more jump brought him to the 16th, where Bollinger was waiting. The window was shut, the drapes pulled back. A single desk lamp threw weak light across the room, and behind the glass, Bollinger stood in silhouette, one hand lifting the latch. No. Graham's boots barely touched the sill before he shoved away back into the night. The shot came through the glass, a burst of light, a spray of shards, but he was already gone, swinging past the window, out of the line of fire. He braced against the 15th floor and looked up. Bollinger was shooting again, this time at Connie. The muzzle flash flickered, a brief orange star against the dark. She faltered, shoulder hitting the wall, but she recovered fast, feet finding the stone as she rappelled downward. Another shot cracked through the wind. Graham's stomach tightened. He watched her descend, waiting to see if she'd make it. Bollinger knew his shots had missed both of them. He left the office at a run, heading for the elevator, and punched the button for the 10th floor as the door slid shut. As the car descended, his mind churned through the plan he and Billy had laid out the day before. Billy had been explicit: kill Harris first, then take whatever time he wanted with the woman but always cut her up afterward. That was his signature after all. Billy had insisted he clean up after Harris, wipe away every trace of blood, wrap the body in plastic, and bring it down to the service courtyard behind the building. They'd haul the corpse away, bury it upstate somewhere. The whole scheme was designed to frame Harris, to make it look like the clairvoyant had murdered his own fiancée and fled. Billy would call homicide, disguise his voice, and confess as Harris, buying them weeks, maybe months of breathing room, a classic misdirection. The lift doors opened. Bollinger stepped out, his foot catching on something, and he pitched forward. The pistol clattered across the floor. He scrambled to his knees, wiped the stinging sweat from his eyes, and croaked Billy's name into the empty corridor. No answer. He was alone. Coughing, he crawled to the gun, wrapped his fingers around the grip, and forced himself upright. The dark hallway swallowed him as he moved to the nearest office with windows facing Lexington. He saved his ammunition, firing only once at the lock. The shot boomed, echoing off the walls, but the door wouldn't give completely. He threw his shoulder against it, pushing until it groaned inward. By the time he reached the windows, Harris and the woman were already below him 2 floors down, rappelling past his position. He cursed under his breath. They'd slipped through his fingers again. He turned back to the elevator, jabbing the button for the ground floor. He'd meet them on the street. That's where he'd finish this. At the 8th floor windows, they agreed to split the final 120 feet into 2 equal rappels, anchoring at the 4th floor before making the last drop. Graham reached the 4th level first, smashing both panes with his fist and snapping a carabiner to the center post. The instant he hooked his safety tether, a bullet cracked into the stone a foot from his head. He knew Bollinger had found them again. He glanced down 60 feet below. The killer stood on the snow-covered sidewalk, shirt sleeves flapping in the wind, looking ragged and desperate. He shouted for Connie to get inside. Bollinger fired again. Graham felt the bullet's impact in his imagination before it happened: a burst of light, the sting of blood. Was this the vision come true? He forced the thought aside, punching out the remaining glass and grabbing the post to haul himself through. Then the street changed. A road grader rumbled around the corner onto Lexington, its massive tires chewing through slush, its plow rising like a wall of steel. Emergency beacons flashed on the cab. The headlights glared through the falling snow like the eyes of some great amphibian. Graham waved frantically, shouting for help, though he doubted the driver could hear him over the engine's roar. Connie joined the cry. Below, Bollinger whirled and fired at the grader. The driver braked, nearly stopping, but Bollinger shot again, the slug ricocheting off the cab's steel frame. The driver gunned the engine. The plow lifted, cleared the curb, and lumbered onto the sidewalk. Bollinger ran. The grader pursued him along the walk before he broke into the street, the machine bearing down on him. He let it close to within 2 yards, then dodged aside, sprinting past and circling back toward the building. The driver struggled to turn the heavy machine. By the time he'd brought it around, Bollinger was standing directly beneath Graham, gun raised. The shot was deafening. Stone shattered beside Graham's foot. The grader charged again, horn blaring. Bollinger planted his back against the building, facing the oncoming behemoth. Graham fumbled for the rock drill at his belt, got it free, and threw it with all his strength. The tool arched through the snow, striking Bollinger not on the head as he'd hoped, but glancing off his hip. It was enough to startle him. He jumped, slipped on ice, stumbled off the curb, and sprawled into the gutter. The driver couldn't stop in time. The plow, raised 12 inches off the street, caught Bollinger at the buttocks, gouging through flesh, crushing his skull against the raised curb. Blood sprayed across the snow, black in the amber lamplight. The bodies of McDonald, Ott, the security guards, and the building engineer laid in heavy plastic bags along the marble floor, waiting for the morgue wagon. Near the shuttered newsstand, Graham and Connie sat in folding chairs with Ira Przewski and 3 other officers. Przewski looked disheveled as always. His damp trousers clung to his legs, his socks were soaked, and he'd forgotten his galoshes again. He fussed over Graham's arm, worried about the bullet wound. Graham patted the bandage and assured him he was fine. The detective then asked about his leg, and Graham admitted with a grimace that he was no worse off than before, which wasn't saying much. Connie's bruises, the paramedic had said, were just bruises. She brushed them off with a wave. Przewski apologized profusely for keeping them so late. He blamed himself for not catching Bollinger sooner. Then he asked if they'd mind waiting another 15 or 20 minutes for more questions from the other detectives. Graham agreed wearily. The detective gave instructions to another officer, a tall, chunky man with a mole on his chin, to ensure they weren't kept longer than that, to get them a squad car home, and to hold off the reporters. Then he turned back to Graham and Connie, advising them to unplug their phones as soon as they got home. The press would be a nuisance for weeks, but at least they could buy a few hours of peace tonight. He shook Graham's hand, gave Connie an awkward half-bow, and squished across the lobby in his wet shoes, dodging reporters outside without answering their shouted questions. Przewski slid behind the wheel of his unmarked car, buckled up, and started the engine. His partner wouldn't need the vehicle for hours. Chains crunched on snow and sang on bare pavement as he drove down Lexington, then turned onto Fifth Avenue, heading downtown. Less than 15 minutes later, he parked on a quiet Greenwich Village street. He walked half a block in the shadows, glancing back once to make sure he wasn't followed, then slipped into a narrow passageway between 2 townhouses. The roofless walk ended at a blank wall, but there were gates on both sides. He stopped at the left one, snow falling gently around him. The wind howled overhead, but didn't reach this sheltered space. From his pocket, he produced a pair of lockpicks trophies from a dead burglar's apartment. He worked the cheap lock quickly, teasing the pins, and was inside within 2 minutes. The courtyard behind the house was small, but charming, a patch of grass, 2 bare trees, a brick patio with wrought iron furniture. In 2 minutes he'd crossed the yard and climbed the 3 steps to the back door. The storm door was unlocked. The wooden door itself took only moments to pick. He stepped into the warm, dark kitchen, closing the door soundlessly behind him. The room smelled of spice cake and overripe bananas. He stood still for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust, listening to the silence of the house. When he could make out every object, he moved to the table, lifted a chair without a sound, and sat down. From under his arm he drew his revolver and held it in his lap. The squad car pulled away as Graham unlocked the front door, leaving fresh tracks in the 5-inch snowfall. He switched on the foyer light, then moved into the dark living room to turn on a table lamp and froze, his fingers still gripping the switch. A man sat in one of the easy chairs. He had a gun. Connie stepped up beside Graham, her hand on his arm, and demanded to know what he was doing there. Anthony Prine stood, gesturing with the weapon. He spoke with a heavy southern drawl, an affectation he explained from his youth. He'd been born with it, shed it years ago, but could summon it when he wanted. It was part of his old identity, the man he used to be. Graham demanded to know how he'd gotten in. Prine admitted he'd broken a window around the side. Then his voice turned colder. He knew what Graham had done to Dwight. He'd driven past the Bowerton building after his show and seen all the police. He knew Dwight was dead. Graham was bewildered. Prine called Dwight one of the best people who ever lived, explained that they'd recognized each other instantly when they met two of a kind. Connie reminded him that Dwight was the butcher, but Prine corrected her. Dwight was only half the butcher. He was the other half. They were identical personalities, incomplete without each other, halves of the same organism. He raised the pistol, aiming at Graham's head. Graham shouted for Connie to run and hurled the lamp at Prine. It knocked the talk show host back into his chair. Graham spun toward the foyer, where Connie was already pulling the front door open. As he followed her, Prine shot him in the back. The impact drove him forward, a blow against his right shoulder blade, a burst of light, blood spattering the carpet. He fell, rolling onto his side, the pain spreading like dark water. Through the haze, he saw Ira Produsky emerge from the hallway that led to the kitchen. The detective shouted something and fired. Prine collapsed against a magazine rack. Graham closed his eyes, then forced them open again, afraid that if he slept he might not wake. Connie was there, wiping sweat from his face. Produsky knelt beside him, explaining that he'd called an ambulance. The detective apologized for coming alone, but he hadn't known who to trust. Bollinger was a cop, and the other half of the butcher might be a cop too. Graham asked about Prine. Produsky said he wasn't dead. Then Graham asked about himself. Produsky assured him he'd survived. The bullet hadn't hit his spine or any vital organs. Connie confirmed it, her voice steady but tight. Graham closed his eyes again, the room spinning around him. Sunday afternoon. Ira Produsky stood by the hospital window, the low sun casting a warm glow around him as he relayed Prine's confession. The talk show host had admitted their plan. They'd wanted to ignite racial, religious, and economic wars, hoping to seize power in the chaos that followed. From the bed, propped on his side, Graham spoke slowly through the haze of painkillers. He understood the strategy gained power from the wreckage. Produsky confirmed that was what Prine claimed. Connie, sitting beside the bed, pointed out the similarity to Manson's delusions, but Produsky noted that Prine dismissed Manson as a cheap hood, while he considered himself something else entirely, a Superman. Produsky lamented Nietzsche's legacy, a brilliant philosopher reduced to a justification for madness. Then the detective's attention shifted. He'd noticed something. He admitted a detective's intuition and asked about the wedding. Connie and Graham exchanged glances, surprised. They'd only discussed it that morning, alone. Produsky explained his reasoning. The way they looked at each other this afternoon was all the evidence he needed. Graham confirmed the news with obvious pleasure. They were getting married in a few weeks, as soon as he was released and had his strength back. Connie added that he'd need it, her tone teasing. Produsky studied Graham's bandages, marveling that they'd survived the ordeal at all. Connie brushed it off, deflecting with a joke. It wasn't so much, was it, Nick? Graham agreed, calling her Nora, his smile genuine and warm. The end. Thank you for listening. The legacy of this story extends beyond the page. Before it became a television film, the novel itself was originally published under a pseudonym. Koontz wrote it as Brian Coffey, a name he used for several early works before his fame took hold. The journey to the screen was a long one. Years before the 1990 production, Koontz had written a script for a proposed television movie for Columbia Pictures and NBC. The executives then promptly quit, and Koontz noted, not because of his script, and the project was shelved by the new management. When it was finally revived, Koontz was brought back to co-write the teleplay alongside Alan J. Gluckman. The production faced interesting challenges. Director Farr had to navigate a tight schedule, with shooting beginning June 4, 1990, and wrapping just under a month later on July 2nd. Pam Dauber, cast against her usual nice girl roles, performed many of her own stunts, suspended from ropes with the rest of the cast. Lee Horsley, who played the height-phobic protagonist, had to channel his own claustrophobia to evoke the terror, since he didn't share his character's fear. There was also the matter of the ending. Some fans and critics noted that the film settled for a more conventional shootout, while the novel's climax was far more kinetic and thrilling, and screenwriter Stephen Tolkien expanded the first hour almost entirely from exposition in the book, creating a whole new beginning from details that Koontz had only mentioned in passing. When it finally aired on CBS on September 30, 1990, it went head-to-head with the second-year premiere of the hugely popular Twin Peaks. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the world of Dean Koontz, we encourage you to pick up the original novel. The experience is richer, the ending more intense, and the terror more deeply felt. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you prefer the book's ending or the film's? Share in the comments below. And if you'd like to join us for more stories, consider subscribing. It's how we know we're bringing you the tales you love. Thank you for being here. Until the next story. Remember, sometimes, courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward despite it.